question would be in your book in chapter 5, where you talk about the fourth estate. You heavily criticize the mainstream press in the United States, and you sort of echo Noam Chomsky's work, Manufacturing Consent, Political Economy with Mass Media, in which he expresses the institutional filters that the news passes through, and eventually the message completely changes. So can you talk about your experience with the mainstream press up until this point? How would you summarize your experience?
As far as your question is concerned, one of the really interesting things is that when we were back in the hotel room in Hong Kong in June of 2013, which is about a year and a half ago now, I recently saw a lot of video from the hotel room meetings that we had because of the film that was released by Laura Poitras, who's the documentarian who lives here in Berlin. And I watched not just the film, but a lot of the raw video. And one of the things I remembered having watched that is that we spent as much time in Hong Kong talking about journalism and media as we did talking about surveillance and privacy. And the reason for that was that we knew that at least as much of a part of what we were doing was a battle of journalism, a battle against establishment media outlets, as much as it was a battle against electronic surveillance. Because we knew that the primary weapon that the United States government and its allies would use to try and attack our reporting and attack what we were doing was to use these media outlets that are very deferential to governments, are very close with governments. They pretend to be adversarial to them, they pretend to be watchdogs over them, but what they really do is disseminate their propaganda, carry out their campaigns. And so a big part of the strategy that we had was to think about how to get around those media hurdles and to avoid having our message, the one that we wanted to be disseminated, drowned by the propaganda campaign that we knew was coming. And so we spent a long time planning and strategizing and thinking about how to make sure the facts that were shown by these documents were able to be heard by the world without having lots of distractions on all sorts of ancillary matters. And we did get attacked by journalists in the United States and the UK particularly, which is really kind of remarkable. This is an act of pure journalism. Every journalist in the world should have been cheering Edward Snowden. He did what every journalist is supposed to be devoted to, which is shining a light on what the most powerful factions are doing in the dark. And yet there was a big division in Western journalism about what it was that he did, what it was that we were doing. But that was something we wanted to happen. We knew we were going to have to engage that fight. And I think as much as there has been a debate about privacy and electronic surveillance and about secrecy and democracy, there's also been a debate around the world about journalism and what the proper role of journalism is supposed to be in a democracy, what the proper relationship is of journalists to the state. And I think that's been as healthy as all of the other debates that have been triggered by these disclosures. For a long time, there has been this idea that the internet was going to revolutionize journalism and politics and just social interaction. And that hasn't fully happened because revolutions like that don't happen quickly. But I think one of the things you are seeing is that the promise of the internet is starting to be fulfilled for politics and definitely for journalism as well. And that's the reason I think these issues are so important. The internet really does have the ability to be this really radical force for democratization and liberalization. But that can only happen if it remains free, if you can use the internet without being monitored and surveilled and controlled. And that's exactly the reason that there's such an effort underway to try and control the internet and to try and convert it from this tool of democratization into a tool of control. And you saw, with the Arab Spring, the first thing that the tyrants who were endangered did was they started to try and gather as much surveillance technology as they could, because they knew two things. They knew that the internet would be this incredibly powerful force that would let people organize against them. But they also knew that if they could control it, it could help them protect their own power. This is the battle that caused Edward Snowden to come forward, and I think that has caused the world to be so interested in these revelations, is exactly that, the power of the internet. And you definitely see so many changes just in journalism alone. I didn't start writing about politics or doing journalism until about 10 years ago. And even 10 years ago, if you wanted to reach a large audience with journalism, you pretty much had to go and work for some big media corporation, for the New York Times or NBC News or some big German newspaper or German television outlet here. And now, just 10 years later, not only don't you need to do that, it actually can limit your influence if you go and work for one of those large institutions. There are people who just on Twitter alone have 100,000 or 200,000 or 300,000 followers who never have worked for a large journalistic outlet in their lives. And so it has completely diversified the kinds of voices that get heard, the types of information that we get, how we think about political issues. I think the best example was 6 months ago when there was an Israeli attack on Gaza. And those kind of attacks have happened so many times in the past, and they usually get talked about in a very specific sort of way. And this time it got talked about much differently. There was a lot more emphasis on the number of civilians who were being killed, the kind of indiscriminate nature of the attacks. And the reason for that was that instead of getting our information from Western reporters who were in Jerusalem, or even some in Gaza who had to channel their reporting through Western editors, we were getting our information from people who live in Gaza, just ordinary people who had cell phones and Twitter accounts or Facebook or Instagram accounts, and would upload video of hospitals being exploded or their neighborhoods being destroyed. And it made it impossible to ignore. It made it impossible for Western media outlets to not cover that because it was being covered elsewhere. And it really changed the way a lot of the world perceived of that conflict. And I think you're seeing that over and over and over again. And that's a really powerful weapon. And that's the reason for me this issue of internet privacy and surveillance is so important, is because the internet is this incredibly valuable tool. And the question is, toward what end will it be put? Will it be put toward the end it was always promised to be, which was increased freedom and strengthening of democracy? Or will it be put toward strengthening factions that are already in power? And I don't know what the answer to that is, but I think that's the battle that's being waged.
Are you satisfied with the political stance of Germany? If not, what would you expect them to do differently, given the situation with Edward Snowden? And secondly, we've observed that programs like the counterintelligence program of the FBI and the chaos program initiated by the CIA is not really recorded in mainstream German historical literature. Could you talk about those programs as well?
Sure. So one of the things that has, I guess, surprised me the most is that there are certain governments. I think all governments have benefited from the reporting we've been able to do, but there are certain governments that have benefited the most. I think the Brazilian government has benefited a huge amount because of how much reporting there was that was done. We were able to report on spying on the entire Brazilian population, but also spying specifically on Petrobras, the oil giant, and then also the personal communications of the president, Dilma Rousseff. Same thing in Germany. I would put Germany as sort of the other country alongside Brazil that has benefited the most, spying on the German population, but also German political leaders. And so what you have, the reason you have that is because there was one individual who was willing to risk everything in order to protect the privacy rights of German citizens and German political leaders. And they benefited greatly from that. And then to watch the very same people who have benefited so much from the sacrifice of Edward Snowden, namely German politicians, be unwilling to risk anything in order to do for him what he did for them, which is to protect his political rights from persecution, has been, I think, not just surprising, but kind of horrible to watch. I actually don't think that the German government would have to risk all that much if it were to give asylum to Snowden. But what we saw even in the investigation that the German parliament pretended to do was that they weren't willing to risk anything, even bring Edward Snowden to Germany just to interview him or to question him, if it meant alienating the United States or angering the United States in any way. So I think the investigation here, the attempts to find out what the NSA was really doing, were more symbolic than they were genuine. I don't think there was any willingness to pay any price at all to get to the bottom of it or even to put real limits on it. And then as far as like the historical examples that you asked about, I mean, there have been decades of abuse on the part of all kinds of governments of surveillance power. And that's why it does surprise me sometimes when some people are kind of nonchalant about the idea of spying, as though it would almost be surprising if the government were abusing that power. We know from decades of history that actually it's almost impossible for human beings to avoid abusing surveillance power. It would be shocking if they weren't abusing it, I think, is the lesson of history. Good evening to everybody, and thank you so much for that really warm welcome, and thank you as well to the City of Munich and to the German Association of Publishers and to the jury for this really profound award, which I am truly honored and humbled to receive. When I learned that I had been chosen for the award, I was, of course, very happy and very gratified. I knew the story of Sophie and Hans Scholl and knew about the award to some extent, but my first thought was that I may not be able to travel to Germany on the date of the ceremony, simply because of scheduling conflicts. And on the day that the award was announced, a German friend of mine called me, very excited, and he said, "Congratulations, I can't wait to go and see the event." And I said, "Well, I'm actually thinking about the possibility that I might not be able to attend. I really want to, but I don't know if I can." And he was outraged, scandalized at even the mere possibility that I was thinking about not attending. And I said, I know it's a very prestigious award, and I would love to go, but it's just a matter of time constraints. And he said, "No, you don't understand. It's not about the prestige of the award. There are a lot of prestigious awards all over the world, and you can't go and go to every ceremony." He said, "It's not about that." He said, "Just spend an hour online reading about what this prize is about and what the spirit behind it is, and you will see that it is the perfect award for what you and Laura Poitras and Edward Snowden tried to do in the work that you did." And I spent 15 minutes reading about the history of the award and the story behind it
and the purpose of why it's awarded. And I immediately knew that there was no choice at all, that it was mandatory that I come. There has been a lot of attention paid to the disclosures of these documents, and rightfully so. We wanted the focus to be on the questions of surveillance and privacy in the internet age. But I actually think that there is at least as important a part of this story, if not a more important part of the story, and that is the human lesson that I think can be learned by looking at the events of the last 18 months. When I went to Hong Kong to meet Edward Snowden in June of last year, I had spent several weeks talking to him on the internet using encryption so that nobody could monitor what we were saying. And other than the fact that I knew he wanted to give me a huge number of documents that he said proved that the US government was illegally spying on the world, other than that, I knew nothing about him. I did not know his name. I did not know where he worked. I did not know his gender or his age. And I traveled to Hong Kong with an expectation of who I was meeting that turned out to be completely wrong. I had this mental image of who he was, and I had assumed that he must be fairly old. In part because I figured if somebody was willing to risk their whole life to expose this injustice, it must be because they have spent year after year after year after year witnessing it and just got to the point where they were no longer able to stand by and do nothing. I also knew that he was going to risk spending the rest of his life in prison. And I think without really consciously describing it to myself, I assumed that it's probably easier to spend the rest of your life in prison if you're 75 years old rather than 25. It just seemed natural to me. And so when I got to Hong Kong and I met Edward Snowden for the first time, I say this without any exaggeration, it was probably the most confusing and disorienting event in my entire life. There before me was not a hardened veteran of the American national security state, but a kid. I mean, he was 29 years old, but he looked at least 5 or 6 years younger. He was wearing a white t-shirt and jeans and was very thin. He hadn't left the hotel room for at least 3 weeks, so he was very pale. He looked like the average nerd that you see in a shopping mall or on a college campus. And when I sat down with him and started asking him about his life, it became even more amazing to me. It wasn't just that he was so young. It was that he was so ordinary. He was somebody who grew up basically poor. He had no power or prestige of any kind. He didn't come from a well-connected or wealthy family with influence. Quite the opposite. He was completely ordinary in every way. He didn't even finish high school. And yet, here was this person, completely ordinary in every way, prepared to do something so extraordinary. We in Hong Kong assumed, we were almost certain, that Edward Snowden's future was going to be sitting in a cage in an American prison by himself for the rest of his life. No prison is a good place to be. But an American prison, when you are accused of endangering national security, is one of the worst places to be. That was the assumption on which we were operating. Now, that was extraordinary enough that he was willing to risk going to prison for the rest of his life at the age of 29. But what was even more amazing to me, and this is something that influenced everything that I did in the work that I was able to do and will influence me for the rest of my life, there was never a single moment, not one moment, when Edward Snowden exhibited any slight fear or hesitation or remorse about what he had done. Even when we thought we were hours away from having people knock on the hotel room where we were working to take him away, even when the US government made him the #1 fugitive of the world's most powerful government, they were so desperate to get him that they actually forced a plane carrying the president of Bolivia to land in Austria. That's how crazy the US government was to get him. Even when all of that was happening, there was never a moment where he thought to himself or showed, maybe I did something I shouldn't have done. And I spent 4 or 5 of the first days when I was in Hong Kong doing very little other than trying to understand what would cause somebody at the age of 29 with a seemingly happy and fulfilled life. He had a very good job. He was making a lot of money. He had a girlfriend who loved him and a family who supported him. He was willing, in fact, eager to throw all of that away simply in defense of a political ideal. He was willing to risk sitting in a cage for the next 40 or 50 years in order to combat this injustice. And I wanted to understand why that was. And what he ultimately told me, and it took a long time for me to understand it, he said that based on his view of himself and ethics and morality and his duties as a human being, that if he had to spend the rest of his life knowing that he had confronted this extreme injustice and had the opportunity to stand up to it, but chose not to because of fear, he said the pain of having to live with that knowledge, the pain of having that sit on his conscience, would be so much worse than anything the American government could do to him. And that was why he did it. Now, one of the things that I have thought about a lot over the past 18 months is that although that seemed remarkable to me at the time, it's actually fairly common. If you look at how injustice is confronted throughout history, not just in the United States, but almost in every part of the world, you'll find that it's essentially the Edward Snowdens, people who are ordinary, who have no particular power or position or prestige, who take it upon themselves to risk everything in order to fight the tyranny or the injustice that they see. It's people like Rosa Parks, the ordinary African-American woman who refused to sit at the back of the bus, or it's a street vendor in Tunisia who sets himself on fire and sparks an extraordinary revolution against the worst tyrannies in the Arab world, or it's kids like Sophie and Hans Scholl who, for whatever reason, risk their own lives knowingly in order to confront one of the worst injustices human history has ever known. And the thing that I've given a lot of thought to over the past 18 months is that we all have that in us. There's a reason why ordinary people are able and willing to take such extraordinary acts. It's just a matter of spending time thinking about what really matters in life, what it is that actually makes us happy, the value of having a clean conscience in knowing that you have done the right thing. And the reason I'm so honored to receive this award in particular is because this is an award that is devoted to asking us to think about those very issues. And the more people think about those questions, the more Rosa Parks and Edward Snowdens and Sophie Scholl's there will be. That was probably the biggest lesson that I learned in doing this work. The lesson is that courage is contagious. You know, whenever I talk to Laura about the work that we ended up doing, we think back to that time in Hong Kong, which was so intense and entailed so many different decisions. And ultimately, I think what we realize now more than anything else is that we almost really didn't have any decision at all. When we saw this 29-year-old in total anonymity, willing to take the biggest risks you can take as a human being, we knew we had the obligation to do this work in the same spirit that animated him. And we knew we were going to be threatened with prosecution by the US government. We knew there was a chance that we wouldn't be able to go back to the United States for a good long time, if ever. We knew that things would happen, like having our internet communications surveilled and monitored, and having the people closest to us, like my partner, detained and targeted. And we felt like we had no choice. The spirit of courage that Edward Snowden displayed infected us. And that in turn infected journalists at The Guardian and journalists at Der Spiegel and journalists all over the world who worked on these materials without any fear of any kind. And this ultimately, to me, is the biggest lesson, which is, you know, I've been writing about politics for 10 years now. And it's very easy sometimes for people, when they look at some kind of an injustice by a powerful government like the United States, to tell themselves, well, there's nothing I really can do. I don't have enough power. I don't really have the ability to stand up to this. And I think the acts of people like Edward Snowden and Sophie and Hans Scholl and so many other people prove how false that really is. The lesson of history is that any kind of injustice, any institution built by human beings can be confronted and resisted and torn down and destroyed by other human beings if the will and the moral courage is summoned. And that's a lesson that I think none of us should ever forget. So I'd just like to make one last point about the lesson that I think can be drawn from the incredible courage of the Scholl siblings. There, I think, is some kind of a resistance sometimes to drawing lessons for contemporary society from heroism or resistance of the Nazi era. There's a tendency to think, well, that is a singular evil, and we shouldn't really make comparisons. And maybe there's some sense in which that's true. But the only way that those kinds of acts do have meaning is if we draw lessons from them. And I think there's also a sense that there's something maybe inappropriate about comparing resistance done in the face of a regime like Nazi Germany to resistance that is done in the context of Western democracies. And I have to say, I find that idea that there's something inappropriate about comparing those things to be really quite invalid. I think that it's really worth asking, first of all, to recognize that democracies are capable of all kinds of horrible acts. The regime that the Scholz confronted was a regime ushered in the first instance through a democratic election. But I think it's worth asking, what do we mean when we talk about democracy? Is it simply that every 3 or 4 years, citizens are able to go into some box and press a button and pick the person that they want to have political power? I think democracy means a lot more than that. The people in Egypt were able 3 months ago to go and press a button for the person they wanted to have political power. People in Gaza were able to do that when they voted for Hamas. People in Afghanistan just did that when they elected a new government. I don't think any of us would say that those are really democracies. Democracy requires more than that. At the very least, what democracy requires, if it's going to be more than just a symbol or a word, is that we as citizens know about what the most important acts are that the people in political power are doing. It has to be an informed choice in order for it to be meaningful. And one of the things that has happened in my country, the United States, but also its closest allies in the UK and Canada and Australia, and I think even to other EU states, is that the fear of terrorism has been exploited to justify an abandonment of those principles. What was most amazing to me in reading through these Snowden documents for the first time was not just how vast and comprehensive the spying was, the fact that there were billions of emails and telephone calls being collected and stored every single day. That wasn't even the most stunning part of it to me. What was more stunning was that my government and the British government and 3 other governments in New Zealand, Australia, and Canada that called themselves democracies had done all of this without any disclosure, any knowledge on the part of the citizens. Now, you can have debates about what details should be kept secret, what technical terms should be concealed, but I can't imagine that there's anybody who would say that governments have the right to do something this significant, to turn the internet into a realm of unprecedented monitoring and control, and to do so without any democratic debate, any disclosure, any knowledge on the part of the citizens who are supposed to exercise informed consent. And the reason that Edward Snowden came forward, and the reason that we decided to do the work that we did in such an aggressive manner, was because we knew that this system was not just a threat to privacy, but a threat to democracy itself. And we wanted to do what I think journalism is supposed to be about, which is blowing a massive hole in the wall of secrecy behind which the world's most powerful governments are operating. And I am thrilled and excited, as I know is Edward Snowden, that the work we've done has created a global debate, not just about surveillance and privacy, but about secrecy and government abuse of power and the proper role of journalism. And it has caused human beings for the first time in the digital age to think about the power of the internet and what it can be if it is free, and compare it to the weapon of oppression and control that it can become if it's not free. And I don't know the outcome of that debate. I don't know what the internet will become. But what I do know is that as a result of the work that we've been able to do over the past 18 months, that decision will be made by all of us in the open. And I can't imagine there's anybody who thinks it should be any other way. So with that, I thank you again very much for coming, and thank you so much to the prize award and the jury for giving me this prize. Thank you so much.
I want to thank you and other social activists like Chris Hedges, Noam Chomsky, Amy Goodman, Chelsea Manning, and Bradley Manning, and many others for doing this work, because it inspired me and 25 other social activists to start an independent, non-profit, grassroots media organization that is free from corporate interest as well as government interest and advertisements. And you've taught us and reminded us the value of an independent media and the role it plays in promoting democracy and upholding it. So to our first question, we know that the European Union and the United States is signing behind closed doors a free trade agreement. Have your revelations sort of exposed, or have you come to the conclusion that the NSA is facilitating this free trade agreement? And secondly, to put it short, would you have time to conduct a short interview with us, perhaps in We'd be grateful for that. Thank you.
Well, I'm glad I've inspired your very creative journalism. Your use of questions to ask for that. No, but thank you for those nice words.
Today we're joined by Glenn Greenwald, the journalist who exposed the NSA documents attained by Edward Snowden. He's also the author of the book called No Place to Hide. Glenn Greenwald, thank you for joining us today.
Great to be with you.
So, Glenn, could you tell us if applications such as Facebook, Google, Yahoo, Skype are safe for our German viewers to use?
No, they're not safe. The companies that operate those services cooperate very extensively with the NSA, in part because they're required to by American law, and also in part because, at least until a year ago, they were very eager and active to do so. So I personally would not trust my data to those companies, but everyone has to make up their own minds about the level of privacy they demand.
So what do you say to those critics that say the growth of Russia and China on the global stage and the dictatorship nations, how would the U.S. counter their influence if it was to draw back on the NSA program?
Well, ironically, right now the U.S. is spending $75 billion a year mostly to destroy privacy on the internet. And when they destroy privacy on the internet, they do things like weaken encryption technologies, privacy protocols, and they actually make the internet more unsafe, easier to attack from other countries like Russia and China. So if the United States spent a fraction of their budget on improving privacy technologies rather than trying to undermine them, they could actually defend their own citizens' communications from invasion by other countries, including Russia and China, and make the internet a safer rather than a more unsafe place to be.
So you've just given us an alternative policy framework that the U.S. government can pursue. What could you tell the individuals to pursue activism to halt this sort of program?
I mean, I think activism, and there's no easy answer to that question. It depends on the individual country. I think there are a lot of pressure points that are being applied by citizens around the world to make their government either curb their own abuses or work to curb the United States'. I think the best thing that an individual can do is to learn the basics of encryption and privacy protection and start using those programs that are available now to build a brick wall around the things that they're doing and saying on the internet, because every individual who does that just makes it that much harder for the NSA to continue to dominate the internet.
Glenn Greenwald, thank you for joining us today.
Edward Snowden is a former intelligence officer who served the CIA, NSA, and DIA for nearly a decade as a subject matter expert on technology and cybersecurity. In 2013, he revealed that the NSA was seizing the private records of billions of individuals who had not been suspected of any wrongdoing, resulting in the most significant reforms to US surveillance policies since 1978. He has received awards for courage, integrity, and public service, and was named the top global thinker of 2013 by Foreign Policy magazine. Today, he works on methods of enforcing human rights through the application and development of new technologies. Ladies and gentlemen, Edward Snowden.
Can somebody put him up on the screen, please? Edward Snowden, thank you for joining us at this late hour. And I want to start with you with some history of intelligence agencies and well-known operations that received less attention, but nevertheless became scandalous back in the day. So COINTELPRO by the FBI, Chaos by the CIA, Operation Mockingbird, MK Ultra, and many others. In 1975, the Church Committee was established to investigate some of the abuses committed back then by the FBI, CIA, and NSA. Could you give us some background on the surveillance state, these programs, and even some examples where perhaps these agencies and their operations made some positive contributions?
Yeah, sure. So the main thing that we're looking at when we look back at the Church Committee, which is an event in, again, the 1970s, as you mentioned, that was actually born out of an act of extremely radical lawbreaking. People forget this because the Church Committee has a very strong reputation in the United States as being this congressional committee that actually lifted up the veil of secrecy off of the CIA, off of the FBI, and looked for the first time in a very substantive and actually adversarial way into what they were doing and went, is this lawful? Is this constitutional? And even if it's both, is it right? And unfortunately, they found that many of those things weren't the case. Now, why I say this was born out of an radical act of lawbreaking that many people forget is that we had the media Pennsylvania burglaries in the United States in 1974, I believe, which many people have never heard of. Even Americans have never heard of this. And this was where a group of citizens who saw things happening in the country, they saw the president was acting in ways that they considered to be contrary to the national interest, perpetuating wars that were costing American lives, supporting a draft that was robbing people of their future, for conflicts that we, in these individuals' belief, never should have been involved in. And so they formed a group called the Citizens Committee to Investigate the FBI. And do you know what they did? They broke into the FBI's office. They literally cased an FBI field office, waited until a holiday period when the FBI agents were out of the office. Everybody was watching, a big boxing event. So nobody was going to be there at work. And when this happened, they literally broke the lock, went in, broke open all the safes, stole all the documents, took them to a barn, and sorted them out, started mailing them to newspapers. Many newspapers sat on them, refused to publish them. So they mailed them to more until eventually the dam broke. Somebody started printing the truth, and eventually investigation had to be had because what it revealed was not only things in the FBI. Well, that was specifically what happened there was they were focusing on the FBI. But that intelligence had gone out of control. Whether it was our internal intelligence services in the United States, this is the FBI, the external intelligence services that spy on people who are sitting in the room there with you, the CIA, the NSA, they were doing what they thought had political benefits, even if it was contrary to our national identity. Now, what do I mean by this? They argued that they were acting in the defense of national security, as we always hear. That's kind of the code word we hear. Don't worry, I turned the screen off there. That's not a technical problem. And this is the lead-in. The FBI argued, look, they were monitoring radical clerics inside the United States who they considered to be in contact. They said they suspected them to be in contact with foreign agents. They didn't have any proof of this, but they said, look, maybe it's happening. The Attorney General saw this case and said, all right, we want to do this. I'll sign off on it personally. I'll put my reputation at risk. Such is the danger that this individual presents. Even though they're an American citizen, they authorized placing this individual on a watch list in the event that there was some kind of national emergency, some kind of protest movement that really started to, shall they say, destabilize the government. They'll bundle this guy off into camps. And of everybody that the FBI was tracking, everybody who's sort of the danger to the American government from their perspective, they said this man was the most dangerous, and this is quoting their words, from the standpoint of national security. For people in the audience who may not be familiar with who that is, that was the most famous civil rights leader in the history of the United States, Martin Luther King Jr., a civil rights advocate who sought to establish recognition of racial equality in the United States. Now, this happened not because he was threatening to bomb places, not because he was doing anything dangerous, but this determination that he was the core threat to the interests of the United States came 2 days after he gave his most famous speech, the I Have a Dream speech, during the March on Washington. Beyond this, the FBI was going further. They weren't just saying he's a threat to national security. They wrote letters based on information that they had gathered by monitoring him in hotel rooms, where he had actually, it was then known to them, had affairs with other women. And they mailed one of these recordings to him along with a letter. This was when he was being awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for his activism, and said, if you don't kill yourself within a certain time period, I believe it was 36 days, might have been, it was somewhere under 40 days, they will reveal the truth, destroy his reputation, so on and so forth. And again, this was routine. This was the kind of thing that was happening there. And why do I say this? Why do I dig up sort of this ancient history? Why do we sort of think about things that were back under J. Edgar Hoover's FBI? Well, it's because these things continue. This is not a radical departure from the operation of intelligence agencies. This is what they do in the dark. This is what happens when you're not looking. This is what happens when they get enough leash, when they get comfortable enough that they won't be held to the account of the public or the law when they go too far. And this here is something that you might go, oh, all right, you know, maybe that happened back then, but we had this church committee. We had these investigations. We saw they tried to assassinate Castro, God knows how many times. We saw they were doing not just COINTELPRO, which was this kind of FBI program that was monitoring the domestic political opposition in the United States, not just CIA programs like MKUltra, where they were funding US and Canadian universities to experiment on US and Canadian citizens, college students, to try to develop sort of a method of crude brainwashing, sort of opinion changing through a combination of sleep deprivation and drugs like LSD. These kind of things were extraordinary excesses, and yes, they ended them. But the same concern with racial activists never went away. It just changed its face. In 2015, we saw that the FBI was again monitoring civil rights groups, protests in Baltimore when they marched for the Black Lives Matters movement. They got airplanes that they contracted that were secretly run by the FBI. They weren't registered in a way that the government was going to say, these are our planes, they're doing surveillance missions. It was uncovered by journalists because they saw a flight path that looked like this. Citizen journalists saw there were planes that during the period of this protest just constantly circled the city again and again and again. And when they looked at later, and they actually started forcing the government, when they started going to records, when they started looking at contracts, they went, you know, this is something that the government is going to have to admit sooner or later. We're going to get caught red-handed on this, so we need to admit it. And they did admit it. They said, look, we did it, but we're just simply trying to maintain the peace. We're just simply trying to maintain national security. What this actually means is the same thing that it meant when they were monitoring Martin Luther King. National security doesn't mean what it sounds like to you and me. National security isn't about preventing foreign troops from landing on US shores, right? We have the largest military spending in the world. We outspend the next 10 nations combined. We could fight a war with the next 10 nations combined and beat them handily. We are an extraordinarily advanced nuclear nation. Our national security is not in question, particularly from political movements. But national security, from the perspective of an intelligence officer, whether there's CIA, the NSA, or the FBI, means stability of the current political system. Now, I don't mean democracy here, right? I don't mean that people are voting. I mean the parties that are in power, the personalities that are in power, cannot be threatened in a way that could sort of radically provoke snap elections, new changes, changes in procedures, policies that agencies would shut down. The government would be really restructured in new ways. That's what they mean by national security, and that's something that I think is not very well understood.
So to continue discussion of history, can you briefly list some whistleblowers who perhaps did not get that much reach as you did, but did meaningful work and influenced your views?
Yeah, absolutely. So when we start at the beginning, the individual you would consider the father of American whistleblowing would be Daniel Ellsberg, which in the same sort of period was protesting the Vietnam War. He was a very senior analyst for a corporation called RAND. He worked for the government in every way that matters. He was the kind of guy who would be briefing the Secretary of Defense. And he revealed a secret study, a top secret study, that said, look, the US lied its way into the Vietnam War, and they continued to lie to perpetuate the war. They had basically thrown the monkey wrench in every peace deal intentionally because they were worried about the political consequences of it. And this was despite the fact that it was a war they can't win. But let's fast forward and leave sort of what we would consider the ancient history of whistleblowing and get into more modern things, right? The post-9/11 era. And it took this long because the Church Committee, which was, again, extremely adversarial to the intelligence agencies, it was not their friend, it was not their defender, it was not their cheerleader. Those held for about 2 or 3 decades. But then we got the September 11th attacks, and this intelligence community complex, right, all the spy agencies that had felt very sore for these 20 years, 20 plus years, had created a secret wish list of all of the changes to law that they would have wanted if they could have passed them, but they knew that they never would have passed with popular support in the United States because they violated the Fourth Amendment of our Constitution, which is the prohibition against not just the unreasonable searching of your home, your electronic communications, where people are listening to your phone calls, where they're breaking into your house, placing cameras, but the seizing of your personal things or your communications in the first place. You couldn't just pull things off the line without a warrant from a court. Well, this was sort of a secret plan that was sitting with the Department of Justice, had been negotiated with the intelligence agencies. When September 11th happened, it came off the shelf. They called it the Patriot Act. And in that moment of national crisis where everybody had been terrorized quite successfully by an extraordinary attack, and in this moment of vulnerability, these agencies exploited that moment of national trauma to pass this. There was almost no dissent. There was, I think, a single dissenting vote in the House from an extraordinarily brave woman. But these things swept into power overnight. But there were individuals who were working in these agencies who saw this happening from the other side. And although the government publicly at the time was saying, look, this isn't going to affect Americans, it's not going to affect your rights, it's not going to affect our allies, this is only about Al-Qaeda, this is only about terrorists, this is only about bad people, faraway people, the enemy, don't worry about it. There's nothing to fear. Individuals like Thomas Drake, Bill Binney, Kirk Wiebe, Ed Loomis, these individuals were sitting at the NSA and they went, well, if this is the case, why are we ordering huge amounts of electronic equipment and putting them inside the United States at telecommunications providers that aren't monitoring foreign communications, they're monitoring wholly domestic communications. And they went through proper channels. They went to the NSA's Inspector General. This is sort of an internal watchdog, right? It's supposed to be a relic of this 1978 era reform of the Church Committee that says, look, when there's problems in classified areas, you go to this watchdog in the government, you tell them what's going on, and they'll fix it. They'll investigate. They'll find, are these activities unlawful? Are they unconstitutional? Are they contrary to the values of the nation? Are they waste, fraud, or abuse of the government's authorities? And when they did this, when they went internally, this one individual, particularly Thomas Drake, is the one the government came after the hardest. The NSA's number 2 lawyer, they've got about 100 lawyers. This guy was the number 2. He talked to Thomas Drake personally. Thomas Drake said, look, I understand the mission. I understand we're in a moment of national crisis, but what you're doing is a violation of the Constitution, a fact which, by the way, was not affirmed by the courts in a meaningful way until more than 10 years later, past 2013. But the program was eventually amended because of the kind of things that he brought forward. In 2006, there were some amendments to the program as well. But the NSA's internal process, this watchdog that was supposed to be protecting the Constitution, that was supposed to be waiting for men like Thomas Drake to stand up and say, whoa, somebody's breaking the rules here, he responded like this.
If he came to me, someone who was not read into the program, and told me that we were running amok, essentially, and violating the Constitution, there's no doubt in my mind I would have told him, go talk to your management. Don't bother me with this. I mean, the minute he said, if he did say, you're using this to violate the Constitution, I probably would have stopped the conversation at that point, quite frankly. So, I mean, if that's what he said, then anything after that I probably wasn't listening to anyway.
This new wave of whistleblowers, the Thomas Drakes, the Bill Binneys, the Kirk Wiebes, the Ed Loomises, even the John Kiriakus, the Chelsea Mannings, if it had not been for them and their examples, I might have replicated their mistakes. Thomas Drake, for going through these proper channels, was hounded by the US government. He was charged under the Espionage Act, the same laws they accused me of violating. This is a law that does not provide a fair trial. You are literally prohibited by law from presenting your defense to the jury. You can't tell them why you did what you did and have them decide if that was basically a relevant enough threat to the operation of the system that your acts made sense. The same way that in the United States, even a murderer can say, look, this person was threatening my life, and the jury can consider maybe this was self-defense, is denied to whistleblowers in the United States who reveal information to journalists. Under US law, it doesn't matter. These men did it anyway. They did everything right. They even went to Congress. Going to journalists was an act of last resort. And for that, the US government destroyed their lives. None of them continued in their career. Many of their pensions were threatened. Thomas Drake was charged with multiple felonies. Bill Binney was pulled out of the shower at gunpoint. Chelsea Manning is currently serving 35 years in prison in the United States. And I say, if it had not been for these individuals, what I did, my own actions, and the public benefits that have derived from them would not have been possible.
We know. We know from the leaks that the NSA has a global surveillance program and is collecting massive amounts of private data. But I would like to touch on details that specifically relate to Germany. Can you talk about these leaks and how do they affect the public here?
Yeah, so I won't get into specific programs that haven't been described by journalists before, because I make sure the people who are doing the documents get a chance to check my biases. If I'm sort of speaking from the hip, there's a chance that I say something wrong, I make the wrong political calculus, and even though there's no guarantee of harm or even likelihood of harm, I have tried to act in absolutely the most responsible way, an overly responsible way, to establish that the government will respond the same, the government will retaliate the same, regardless of how careful the whistleblower is. Whether an individual in the United States goes to WikiLeaks or they publish these things directly, unredacted on the internet themselves, or whether they work as I did, where you have a system of checks and balances where journalists have the material, they make the publication decisions, not myself. And then they even give the government a chance in advance of publication to review the stories and go, hey, maybe you guys don't understand the details here. Maybe you don't see the big picture here. Maybe there's one little sentence here that you don't quite get. We'll put a human life at risk here. And because of this, we'd like to share this evidence with you that that is in fact the case, and for you to consider whether or not you want to modify your story as a result. And that has been followed in every case in the reporting that has arisen from me. But despite that, the US government makes no distinction whatsoever. And I think this is an important thing to establish because it means the government's not actually concerned with harm mitigation. They're not actually concerned with saving lives, with protecting programs, or ensuring that human sources or the efficacy of our security apparatus continues unimpeded. What they're looking for are easy arguments, things that sound persuasive at first glance, like saying, oh, this is going to endanger sources and methods. Oh, these journalists have blood on their hands. But when you look at cases, for example, the case of Chelsea Manning, again, she went to trial. The US government was able to present their best evidence. They had control. It was a military court. They could hold secret proceedings for sections if they wanted to present classified information. And despite all of this, the government was asked by the judge to present evidence of any harm that came as a result. And again, remember in the case of Chelsea Manning, these were things that were presented on WikiLeaks. They eventually made their way to the public in completely unredacted form. And these were classified documents, I think roughly 750,000, both military records and diplomatic records. And in court, in front of the judge, the US government said, we can't demonstrate that anyone has been hurt, that anyone has died, and we aren't even going to try. Because from our perspective, it doesn't matter. Now, if this is the case, and I know we've run a little bit long here, but this is a central point that I think a lot of people don't quite get because much of the media is afraid to confront this point because they're afraid they'll lose access to government officials, to anonymous sources, to senior White House officials, senior administration officials, in whatever country they're in, their equivalent, if they don't simply repeat it. If they don't just say, well, these officials said this, and treat it as if it's reliable, rather than challenging the claim. But what's actually happening here? Why is this happening? If they're not interested in saving lives, if they're not interested in protecting these things, and if Chelsea Manning was going to trial in 2013, 4 years after the documents were revealed in 2009, and in 4 years, the government couldn't show that anyone had been hurt, maybe it's just about changing the subject. Maybe the government would rather talk about the theoretical risks of journalism when you're in an open society with a free press where mistakes could possibly be made. Someone could possibly be hurt, although it's never happened. Not in national security reporting, not in the way we've seen. We have no public evidence, not in my case, not in Manning's case, not in any other case that we can think of, not Ellsberg, not Binney, not Drake. If this is the case, they don't want to talk about they do want to talk about the theoretical risks of journalism instead of the concrete harms of their policies, of their programs, of the decisions, the way this is affecting everyone in the United States and around the world. They don't want to have a conversation about what's been done. They want to have a conversation about what might happen if you don't trust them. What might happen if journalists investigate them in the absolute worst case? And I say, ladies and gentlemen, the absolute worst case that could happen is that we don't ask those questions, is that we do simply trust the government because we have evidence that when we do that, things go wrong. You asked generally about what kind of programs were happening, not just in Germany, but around the world. This is the one that everyone's familiar with, the PRISM timeline. PRISM is a particular collection program under a specific authority in the United States. This is a little bit legalistic, but it's called Section 702 of the FISA Amendments Act. This was passed in 2008 as a revision of the Protect America Act of 2007. And this was when the US internet service providers, the one that everybody relies on around the world, started going beyond what the law required to cooperate with the government and give them access to people's data without warrants. Now, the US government will go, no, no, this isn't true, this isn't true. And in a very narrow sense, they have an argument about American citizens. If you're a US citizen, they have to get a warrant before they can force these providers to give this information to them. The providers can still voluntarily give it to them. And this is in fact a business model for places like AT&T. AT&T will give your information to the government. AT&T is one of the largest telecommunications providers in the United States. They'll give this information to the government as long as they pay for it, even without a warrant. They'll use lower standards of requests like subpoenas. But it's not just PRISM. There's also what's called the Upstream collection program. Now this happens both under that same authority, Section 702 of the FISA Amendments Act, that's the FAA 702 at the top. This is the transatlantic internet cables and the ones that are happening under the ground. This was happening not only in the United States at every sort of border exchange point, every major internet exchange point in the United States, but happening in Germany through the BND. They have their own code names for it, and they were kind of trading communications with the NSA of German communications as if they were baseball cards. We saw programs that were being used to analyze these, right? Which were not what you would expect. This wasn't about thwarting plots from Osama bin Laden, but rather the NSA's own documents. This is a top secret classified report that's being reported on here. They were using this information, everything that's pulled from these internet service providers, everything that's pulled from these communications of these trans of the world, to spy on things like the pornography viewing habits of people that they considered to be radicalizers. Now, these were individuals that their own documents said were not terrorists. They were not known to be associated with violence. They were not promoting violence, but they were considered to be people who had persuasive arguments about why a more radical version of Islam would be more attractive. And so they wanted to stop it by going, this is a conservative religion. Maybe we can leak this and discredit these. You might think that's appropriate, but you know, these are the kind of questions that we should answer publicly, politically, rather than have a few officials behind closed doors do it. The GCHQ, the British NSA, was intercepting webcam images from people around the world. Anybody who was using Yahoo Messenger back in the day, I believe it was every 5 minutes, it was snapping a picture from the webcam, or it was intercepting a picture from the web stream every 5 minutes and saving those largely permanently, very long periods of time. The British government knew it had sexually explicit images in it. They knew a lot of their employees had looked at them. They kept it going anyway. It was happening in Australia. This is recently, actually post-2013, where new metadata bulk collection laws, right? This is the government's preferred way of describing mass surveillance, which is this indiscriminate targeting of surveillance where you collect everyone's communications, whether they're a terrorist, whether it's you, whether it's the person sitting next to you, whether it's your mother, whether it's the person you walk by on the street, everybody's communications are collected. These kind of laws are sweeping the world. It's legal in the United States. It's legal in Canada. It's legal in Australia. I believe Germany is actually beginning to embrace this as well under laws that they say are reform laws, but are actually making things worse. But when they have access to these laws, what are they using them for? Well, in Australia, the Australian Federal Police used it to try and identify the source of a journalist whose reporting they didn't like very much. We saw in the US-Australian exchange, they were trading information about the communications of American law firms, which, by the way, the US NSA is prohibited from spying on without a warrant. But the Australians did it for us and then passed the information to us, so that was all okay, even though that's supposed to technically be a violation of law. And what were these lawyers doing, right? They weren't negotiating arms deals. This wasn't about transnational terrorism. They were representing the trade partners of Australia, I believe it was Indonesia, a trade deal about the price of shrimp and clove cigarettes. We saw the British were hacking the Belgian telecommunications provider, even though they had legal ways to get at that information simply by asking the Belgians for support. But all of these things get back to something quite simple here, which is the idea that governments don't like to ask permission. Governments don't like to follow procedures. Governments don't like to be bound by the same laws that you and I are. When they draft these laws, they create exceptions. When there aren't enough exceptions, they make their own. And as long as they have this shield of the state secrets privilege, this sort of shade of secrecy that they can cover their actions with, by the time we, the people, by the time journalists, by the time the public learns about them, the officials who are most responsible for these violations of our rights are often out of office. And this is why, the only reason this continues, the only reason this kind of paradigm can continue is because we don't punish officials who do this, even in the most egregious cases. Yes, Barack Obama authorized the warrantless wiretapping of everyone in the world in the United States. Americans, he collected their communications, unconstitutionally seized them, which is a violation of the Fourth Amendment. The courts ruled that his programs of mass surveillance related to telephony metadata had not only been unlawful from the time they were authorized more than 10 years before, but were likely unconstitutional, and they described them as Orwellian in their scope. But that's surveillance, right? You might go, all right, as terrible as that is, he's just spying on everyone. In the Bush White House, he literally tortured people, right? He committed clear war crimes. Obama, to his credit, did end the torture program in its most direct incarnation. He's continued the drone program. He's expanded the surveillance program, but he did not investigate the Bush administration. And when we have this two-tiered system of justice, where when you're a whistleblower and you go to the number 2 lawyer in the NSA and you go, hey, you know, these new programs might be violating the law, they might be violating the Constitution, he tells you to get lost. He puts the Department of Justice on you. You get investigated. You lose your job, you lose your house, you lose your wife, you lose your freedom because you go to jail, you get arrested. But if you are the president and you torture people, you have people killed, people who you don't know, people who you don't have identified, people who just happen to be holding a cell phone that a spy agency tells you that at one point was associated with terrorism, you will never see the inside of a courtroom. Instead, you'll see a book deal. Instead, you'll get, you know, medals of freedom pinned around your neck by all these other people. This creates a system of incentives that will shape human behavior in obvious ways. If you were the president, you had unlimited power. You knew that you could get away literally with murder, and no one would hold you to account for it. Why wouldn't you? Now, there are some people who might have the moral fiber to hold back from that. There might be some who will go, I won't do this, I won't do that. And that's better than nothing. But how do we get powerful officials, whether it's the president of the United States, whether it's the chancellor in Germany, whether it's the president of Russia or China or anywhere else, to abide by all rights, to respect all people everywhere at all times? The only way we can actually make sure that happens is if we can see what they're doing, when they're doing it. We can witness crimes, and then we can enforce penalties. That's something that's missing, and until we change that, we, and ultimately liberal society around the world, will be at risk.
So, Edward, I'd like to run one last question from us and then some public, so forgive us if we take a few more minutes of your time. In 1975, Senator Frank Church, who we just talked about with the Church Committee, appeared on NBC and said, if this government ever became a tyranny, if a dictator ever took charge in this country, the technological capacity that the intelligence community has given the government could enable it to impose total tyranny, and there would be no way to fight back, because the most careful effort to combine together in resistance to the government, no matter how privately it was done, is within the reach of the government to know. This was 1975, and you've been saying this too. Do you think with Trump in power now, this warning will turn into a reality?
I think the focus on Trump is a mistake. You can look anywhere, look at any newspaper, look at any sort of public commentator, and you can see all of the criticisms of the Trump policies and administrations and all of the issues that they have there, right? They're clear, it's obvious. Yes, we are in uncharted times. Yes, we are facing a period not just of localized risk, but of systemic risk. But what should we actually be looking at, right? Faith in elected leaders to fix our problems is the mistake that we keep repeating. When President Obama was elected to the White House, he said all of the right things, right? He said he was going to make a more equal America. We were going to move into a period of cooperation rather than partisanship. He said he was going to close Guantanamo on day one of his administration. It's still going to be open on his last day of his presidency. He said there's going to be no more warrantless wiretapping in America. We don't do that. We don't need that. That's not who we are. And in fact, he expanded it. He made it worse. It went deeper. It got better. It got more sophisticated. It got more pervasive. And it continues, right? If we're hoping for a champion, if we're waiting for a hero, we will be waiting forever. Because it's not a politician that you're looking for. It's the people in this room. It's you. It's the person sitting next to you. All of us have a responsibility. We can't fix it by ourselves as individuals, but we don't need to. What we have to do is make one change, a small change, a positive change that can be replicated, that can be shared. We need to create our ideas. We need to think about these problems. We need to identify not that Trump is a bad person, but why he is so threatening. And we need to start creating defenses for it. Moreover, we need to realize that defense is not enough. We need to create an offense for free and open society. We need to recognize that one of the central problems right now is one of debate. Words no longer have the same meaning that they once meant. We hear words like terrorism, and we go, ooh, that's terrible. As long as it's terrorism, we have to stop everything. And when you think about terrorism like a normal person, that makes a lot of sense. Nobody wants people flying planes into towers. Nobody wants people detonating bombs in marketplaces or on subways or shootings in the street, right? But terrorism doesn't have a single agreed upon definition. There are governments charging people with terrorism who are simply acting in ways that are traditionally considered to be political protest, right? Many governments, particularly the British government, is particularly bad here, where they consider any threat to sort of that systemic stability, even if it's an act of journalism, even if it's an act of speech, suddenly is transformed into an act of terrorism, right? But it's not just terrorism. It also happens on the positive side of our language in addition to the negative side of our language. When we think about things like freedom and openness, democracy, liberty, and human rights, right? We've moved from a belief that as long as things are proper and appropriate, as long as things are moral, they're sustainable, they're supportable, they're things that we should back, to a belief that legality is the same thing as morality. As long as the government says someone broke the law, we infer, we believe instinctively, it means they did the wrong thing. But ladies and gentlemen, sometimes the only moral action, the only moral choice is to break the law. Germans know this far better than many other countries. But it's not a uniquely German problem. In the United States, whether we're talking about the abolition of slavery, the prohibition of alcohol, whether we're talking about the enfranchisement of women, allowing them to vote, all of these activities were considered to be threats to stability of the days. These were things that terrorized institutions and government officials. These made these individuals uncomfortable. It made them feel vulnerable. It made them feel threatened. And you know what? That was exactly the right choice. When people are progressing the boundaries, when they're expanding the borders of human rights, right? That always begins as a riot against orthodoxy. Whether it happens in the street, whether it happens in the newspaper, whether it happens in writing, whether it happens on the TV, it is a contest against the status quo. You have to remember that all of these injustices that happened all throughout history, the worst things that you can imagine, whether it's in your domestic history or international history, were legal at the time. Abuses of human rights are always legal in the national context when the government wants to do those kind of things, at least for the period of operation. It may be years later that it's condemned. It may be years later that it's disowned. It may be years later that someone sees the inside of the courtroom. But power is its own law. And we have to think about, how do we remediate that? How do we make things a little bit better there? And this is a difficult question. I can't claim that I have the answer, but I think one of the things that we start forgetting about is to recirculate basic principles, basic ideas that everybody needs to share if we're really going to live in a free society, if we're really going to live in a free world. And that's that human rights belong to everyone. The worst excesses of the US surveillance system are premised upon a single idea, which is that Americans get one set of rights, everybody else gets basically no rights. And you know, if you're an American, that might sound fine. And that's the reason that these policies still enjoy some support, is they go, well, it's not happening to me, I don't care, right? I'm not the one being threatened. But 95% of the world's population lives beyond the borders of the United States. And the same is true of practically every country, right? The percentages change here and there, but it's a big world. And we have a lot of people. And if we're going to protect the rights of anyone, we have to be able to protect the rights of everyone. And this gets back to thinking about, well, why do we have rights? What are we protecting? What are we trying to create? What are we envisioning? Where are we trying to go? And I would argue this is the idea of liberty. But if you ask people, ask the person next to you what liberty means to them, right? They might not be able to articulate it very clearly. Everybody will have a different answer, right? And we need to think again about what liberty means today. I think liberty is the right to liberty is the right to act without permission. It's the ability to take a choice without worrying what it's going to look like in some government databases, without having to worry about what some government bureaucrat is going to do. Are they going to be upset? Are they going to retaliate? Are they going to do something that will impact your rights, your freedoms, right? Liberty is being able to live day to day, moment to moment, in an instant, from your own head, from your own self, from your own community, thinking about your family, rather than thinking about structures that owe you no loyalty, that see you as more of a potential threat than a potential ally, right? And this is something that really isn't a solution, right? But it is a beginning. If we can agree that in a free country, in an open society, the number of times people have to ask permission to do things, the times people have to register to do things, the times that people have to worry that government officials are going to be trawling through their web history, they're going to be looking at the records of who was in this room right now, because I hate to tell you, ladies and gentlemen, if you have a cell phone on you right now, you've left a permanent record of being at this talk. Not that it's going to get you thrown in jail, but that it's discoverable. and an intelligence agent who might be sitting like me in Hawaii or sitting in Darmstadt or Ramstein or one of these other areas, Bad Aibling, could look at these and make inferences about who you are, about what you believe, about what you're likely to do. I don't believe that we should live in a world where every time you pick up the phone to call someone you love, to talk to a friend, to share an idea, to just tell someone about what was happening in your day, that you need to think, what's this going to look like? That is many things, ladies and gentlemen, but I would argue that that is fundamentally illiberal. It is fundamentally unfree, and it is fundamentally unjust, and it should change.
Ursula from Karlsruhe, how does a normal day for you look like?
I do talks in Munich. No, but seriously, one of the most extraordinary things about my life past 2013 is that I ended up in exile, right? My government did absolutely everything it could to make sure that I wouldn't be heard. They canceled my passport when I was flying to Latin America, which would be considered to be a fairly neutral region of the world, when they knew I was transiting through Russia. We don't know why, right? The government won't actually reveal their decision-making at the time here. But no one had informed me my passport had been canceled by the time I left. The government of Hong Kong has said that the US government might have been in the process, but they hadn't actually officially canceled it so far as they were concerned. But by the time I landed in Russia, I could no longer travel. And when I was trapped in the Russian airport, I couldn't leave, right? I didn't say, hey, let's go into Russia, this is good enough. I applied for asylum in 21 different countries around the world, one of which was Germany, right? Others were France, places like Norway. All of them found reasons not to respond or to say no, except those countries, those neutral countries in Latin America. When it was heard that maybe the Bolivian president, Evo Morales, during a trade summit in Russia, might secretly take me back to Bolivia to enjoy asylum there, which, by the way, the United States itself recognizes what they consider to be a fundamental human right to seek and enjoy asylum. This is in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and many other international agreements, which in the US systems of law are actually superior to statutory obligations, superior to, for example, the Espionage Act. They're on a higher tier of law, with the Constitution considered the supreme law of the land, because the Constitution has provisions in it about the treatment of treaties. But despite this, when they thought I might be in a presidential plane that has diplomatic immunity that can't be interfered with, crossing Europe to go to Latin America, 4 European countries closed their airspace to block Evo Morales from traveling back home, just on the mere rumor that I was on board. And this meant I couldn't travel. I still can't travel because they were afraid of what I might say. They were afraid of what people might think if they heard other opinions, other viewpoints, right? Now, this is a long way of saying that, yeah, now I live in exile. And, you know, you would think it would be really difficult. And there are costs. You know, I'm not home. I'm away for the holidays. It's difficult to see my family. And of course, there's a lot that anybody misses about being at home, you know, even speaking their own language on the street, right? Russia's a very different society. But while I put my head down at night on a pillow in Russia, I wake up and I speak every day around the world. I'm part of a different conversation, a global conversation that today, thanks to technology, can no longer be stopped. And this, for me, is a source of hope. Because for the longest period, Governments loved exile. It was their favorite tool, right, for countering revolutionaries and radicals. Because if they executed people, right, it would lose them favorability. People would think the government was too harsh. But if they simply forced people out, kept them outside the borders, wouldn't allow them to enter freely on penalty of imprisonment or death, they could stop the conversation. And for them, that was the most important part. But those old bad tools of political repression are beginning to fail. And not just for the United States, ladies and gentlemen, because the United States is not, contrary to what may be popular in some radical sources or circles, the biggest, dangerous, most bullying threat to human rights in the world. There are other countries that are even worse, countries that are more intrusive. We have new surveillance laws being passed in Russia that are incredibly extreme. Russians call it the Big Brother law. And if Russians are calling it the Big Brother law, you got to watch out. The United Kingdom passed the most extreme surveillance measure in the history of the Western world in a free and open society that was backed by their now prime minister, called the Investigatory Powers Bill, right? Doesn't sound particularly threatening, doesn't sound particularly dangerous, but it encoded and enshrined in law the mass surveillance regime, the kind of bulk collection that we were discussing before. All kinds of different government agencies in the UK can now trade around people's web histories, not just the intelligence services, not just MI5, not just MI6, not people you would think like James Bond types, and not just police, but places like tax agencies, places like health administrations, like local bureaucracies, simple government agencies that should never have access to this type of information now can, because it's being collected and it's being protected and it's considered the proper action of government. We see in countries like China, they're passing new surveillance legislation under the same guise of anti-terrorism legislation that the United States has used, sort of political cover for curtailing rights. And when they were challenged on it, Chinese officials said, "Why are you bothering us? We're doing the same thing the United States did." And the sad thing here is that they have a point. This should never be the state of the world, right? The reason we were so successful coming through the Cold War, the reason the Berlin Wall falling down was such an extraordinary accomplishment, not just for people in Germany, but people throughout Eastern Europe and beyond, was we had a clash of cultural values where there were governments on one side that said, we will stop at nothing, particularly in terms of domestic surveillance and things like that. Organizations such as the Stasi, which would be running extraordinarily huge informant networks throughout communities and things like that. And on the other side, we had governments that would accept some restraints and would say this was actually a distinguisher. This was what made them good. This was made them just. This was how you could see that their example was worth emulating, because they could foreclose upon these methods, at least to some extent. We know it's not true in all cases because of what we just described earlier with Martin Luther King Jr. But largely, in the most aggressive sense, they could say, we don't need these powers. We reject these powers because they are corrosive, not just to civil participation, right? Not just to what people feel in their communities, but to trust in government. If people can't trust us, if people can't identify with us, we can't be successful. And this is something that you see in most societies around the world that have serious struggles with low-level corruption, right? The question is, when somebody encounters upon a police officer, what do they think? Do they think this is a problem? Do they think they need to get a bribe ready? Or do they feel safer, right? I grew up in a mindset in the United States, justified or unjustified, just the way I was raised, the political systems into which I was indoctrinated. When I saw a police officer, I felt better, right? That's no longer the case for me now. But not just for me. A lot of people around the United States look at police and they go, these don't look like police anymore, these look like soldiers. We have military equipment that's being transferred to police. And again, when we look at these things, when we look at how we live, when we look at the choices we have, you ask me, how do I live every day? I wake up in the morning and I smile, glad for the decisions that I took before. Yes, they cost a lot, right? Yes, they were not enough. Yes, we got new reforms, but they don't make a dent in the level of injustice that we see sort of surging around the world, across borders, in every place, in every region right now. But I have an idea of what I can do next. And I would ask you, turn that question around on yourself. I don't mean this as a criticism. I mean this as an opportunity. And think, how are you living your life? When you wake up in the morning, you think about going to work, right? You think about what you've got to do, your obligations to your family, having to go to the grocery store, whatever, what shows are on tonight. This is normal human life. Nobody looks down on you for this. Nobody should look down on you for this. But think about the opportunities that you have, right? Because there are no heroes. Nobody's going to save you, right? There are only heroic actions. There are only heroic choices. There are only people who moment by moment see bad things and recognize, maybe I can do something. Maybe I can't fix everything, but maybe I can make progress. Maybe I can make things better. Maybe I am the one that I'm waiting for. And as soon as you start thinking like that, you'll realize that you are.
Edward Snowden. Edward Snowden, human rights advocate, activist, and whistleblower, thank you so much for joining us today.
Maybe next year we'll do this in person.
I will be there.
Erstmal schön, dass ihr alle da seid und das freut uns natürlich sehr, dass acTVism in 3 Jahren so viel geschafft hat und dass wir jetzt hier stehen, wo wir hier stehen und tatsächlich Edward Snowden interviewen können.
It's a pleasure to have you on today.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
It's great to be with you guys.
Thank you for joining us today. Edward Snowden, human rights advocate, activist, and whistleblower, thank you so much for joining us today. This whole evening is done by volunteers. I only embody all of their work. I'm just asking questions. It's their work, the camera people, the people putting on the live stream, the people at the gates. Please welcome to the stage all the volunteers.
Glenn Greenwald is a former constitutional lawyer, a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, and the author of several bestsellers, including Liberty and Justice for Some and No Place to Hide, Edward Snowden, the NSA, and the U.S. Surveillance State. He is acclaimed as one of the top 25 political commentators by The Atlantic, one of America's top 10 opinion writers by Newsweek, and one of the top global thinkers for 2013 by Foreign Policy. He was a columnist for The Guardian until October 2013 and is a founding editor of The Intercept. Ladies and gentlemen, Glenn Greenwald.
Hi, Glenn. How's it going in Brazil?
It's going great. I'm a little bit jealous that I'm not there with you in Munich. It's one of my favorite cities in the world, but otherwise I'm doing well.
Perfect. I tracked you down twice when you were here, and I was able to manage 2 interviews, but this is the third one. So let's just begin with Donald J. Trump. There's this perception about Trump that he's a madman. He's unorthodox. He's breaking from conventional American politics. And he's not following, in many issues, the same line as his predecessors. So what is your take? Is Donald Trump breaking from orthodoxy? Is he a continuation, or is he a mixed bag?
I think it's important to separate the stylistic or rhetorical analysis with regard to that question from the substantive and policy analysis. So obviously, as a matter of personality, as a matter of rhetoric, and as a matter of style, Trump is something unlike we've seen before in terms of somebody occupying the Oval Office and being the representative of this vast power that the United States continues to wield in the world, the way he speaks, the things he says, his refusal to abide by protocols and conventions. But if you actually look at the policies that he has overseen and implemented, and even the way in which he defends those policies, I think that it's far more a continuation and a byproduct of American political culture than something unrecognizable or aberrational. There's a lot of people who want to pretend that what he's doing is some kind of radical break from the American tradition because they're embarrassed, because his rhetorical newness does sort of take the mask off of the face of what the reality of the United States and the world is. And so they want to pretend that this is something all new. And I remember when Trump had General Sisi of Egypt to the White House, the American media decided to pretend that this was something brand new that we had never seen before, an American president embracing a tyrant. And of course, American presidents have embraced tyrants. It's been central to American foreign policy for decades. And I think you see that over and over. There's a lot of pretense that what Trump is new, but the reality is he's far more a continuation than a deviation from American political history.
Let's dig deeper into that for a second, Glenn. So what about the surveillance state? In 2013, you exposed the entire NSA cache that Edward Snowden had leaked. And some of the things were like millions of Germans are being, their data is being collected without their consent. WikiLeaks also from this cache revealed that our chancellor's handy is being spied on by our so-called allies. And this investigation was dropped last year. So how has the state of mass surveillance been under Donald Trump? And what do you think, how Germany has reacted to this generally up to this point?
So I think that's a great example of what it is that I was just saying is the Snowden reporting that we were able to do, showing that there was this massive scheme conducted and constructed largely in the dark to spy on the entire internet, including hundreds of millions of Germans and other people around the world, was not something that was done by Donald Trump, but was done by his predecessor, George Bush, and then especially Barack Obama. And the war crimes that WikiLeaks exposed in Afghanistan and Iraq and other places as a result of the brave leaks of Chelsea Manning were not crimes committed under Donald Trump. They were crimes committed under George Bush and Barack Obama. And so I think that when you look at the actual apparatus of national security that the United States continues to be shaped and governed by, it has changed very little under Donald Trump. There was some early indications from him rhetorically that he intended to actually restrain a lot of this militarism, restrain a lot of the imperial behavior that people on the left and even increasingly some on the right have been so critical of. And I think that although there was some rhetorical indications from Trump early on that he intended to radically restrain or alter the role that the U.S. plays in the world, if you look at what the U.S. is doing in the world militarily, in terms of the CIA, in terms of the NSA, it's very much unchanged.
So since we're at state surveillance, let's move on to corporate surveillance. Facebook, as you know, handed out 87 million users' data to Cambridge Analytica, which then gave it out for political purposes to Donald Trump's campaign. So, I mean, it's not really a deviation if you look at the principle at play, giving data without your consent, because your revelations revealed in 2013, you presented slides which showed that how corporations are willingly giving data to the NSA. Can you comment on this scandal and also generally on the state of affairs of privacy of individuals?
Well, I guess I'm always a little bit surprised whenever there's surprise about the fact that large Silicon Valley companies don't actually care about our privacy. This is, I think, in general inherent to how corporations think, to the extent we can talk about corporations, how they reason. They're interested in profit motives and not social values. In fact, there are laws in the United States and also in various countries in Europe that require corporate managers to think first and foremost about corporate profit and how to maximize it, and not think about how to maximize social value. So it would be very surprising if Silicon Valley companies, the largest and most powerful corporations human history has ever known, had decided at some point that they were going to sacrifice corporate profit in order to protect social values. And as you suggested, a lot of the reporting that we were able to do show that these Silicon Valley companies, particularly the biggest ones, Google, Facebook, Yahoo, Apple, Microsoft, were actively and aggressively collaborating with the US government and its four surveillance allies around the world in the UK, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia, when they were able to do that without anybody knowing about it. I think what has actually changed as a result of the Snowden reporting is that these companies now do take greater steps in order to protect people's privacy, not because Eric Schmidt at Google or Mark Zuckerberg at Facebook suddenly woke up and decided, actually, you know what, we kind of are wrong and we should value privacy more. It's because people around the world began to be worried about what it would mean if they were using Facebook and they were using Google. And Facebook executives and Google executives were very worried that social media companies in Germany and Brazil and Korea would be able to tell the next generation of internet users, don't use Facebook and Google because they're going to give your data to the government, the US government, use ours instead because we'll protect your privacy. So because of those commercial pressures, these companies actually have been implementing some meaningful privacy protections. But at the same time now, this is the war that the US government, the UK government, governments around the world are on the one hand trying to pressure social media companies to give them as much data as they want. When they don't, they get publicly accused of being aiders and abettors of terrorists, as the US and UK governments have done with Facebook and Google when they refuse to turn over data. And you see now Facebook starting to do things like weaken encryption for WhatsApp, which caused the founder of WhatsApp just recently, this week in fact, to resign from the company and leave the board of Facebook. But on the other hand, you still have tens of millions of people around the world. I would say principally the country where this is true the most is in Germany because of the history of digital privacy, but also in lots of other countries, including where I am now in Brazil and the United States, where people are unwilling to use technology companies if they believe that those companies are going to undermine their privacy. And that's really the central war that's taking place right now, is the war for public opinion, not because these companies care about public opinion in and of itself, but because they perceive it as a threat to their profitability if they're perceived as being privacy violators.
You recently wrote a piece about Facebook's subordination in terms of the Israeli government as well as the government of the United States in deleting accounts or deleting accounts of people who are on the sanction list, as well as suppressing activism. Can you elaborate on that, please?
Sure. So I think there is this interesting debate taking place, and it's taking place on the left, the global left, about the extent to which we want governments and corporations, Silicon Valley corporations, to control and regulate and censor the political content that is available for us to see. And I think there's always this appeal for people to want to support censorship, which is, well, I believe that if we empower Facebook executives or Twitter officials or government officials to regulate speech under the guise that it's hate speech or fake news, the kinds of opinions that I dislike and that I think are threatening or that I think are misleading are going to be suppressed, and therefore society will be better. And that's an appealing way to think, but I think it's an extremely dangerous and usually misguided way to think, because usually the people who exercise power and who are going to be able to control what we see and we don't see aren't people who think the way that you think, if you're on the left, for example. They're not going to be looking to censor Israelis who are cheering for genocide or apartheid in Gaza. And they're not looking for people in the United States who are calling for Iran to be bombed, as Twitter is offering every single day, or for minorities to be attacked. They're going to cater to the powerful. And the powerful in the case of the Middle East, for example, is not the Palestinians, but Israel. And so Facebook officials have been meeting with the Israelis. Whoever the Israeli government tells Facebook is an inciter of violence and terrorism gets their account suspended, their account deleted. That has included scholars. It's included journalists in the West Bank. That Facebook is essentially being subservient to the dictates of the Israeli government. We've seen the same thing with the United States. If you are a group that the United States decides to call a terrorist organization, which in the past has included things like the African National Congress and Nelson Mandela, then Facebook executives and Twitter executives will censor political content. But if you're somebody who wants to cheer Donald Trump or call for additional violence in the Middle East, you won't be censored. And so I think we need to be extremely careful if we believe in internet freedom about not being tricked into supporting censorship based on this lovely idea that the views that we think are violent and we think are dangerous are going to be suppressed, because in almost every case, the opposite is going to happen. It's the views that you like, the views that you support that are going to end up being suppressed. In the case of Facebook, censoring Palestinians from the internet at the behest of the Israeli government is a perfect illustration of that danger.
Since we're at the Middle East, let's talk about Syria. There's so many conflicting reports, chemical attacks by Jaish al-Islam, radical extremist Islamic group. I don't call it Islam, but let's just put it that way since the media does right now. And also then there's Assad attacking, and then what do you think should be the conclusion here on a policy framework? Should the Western government intervene forcefully in these cases?
So I think it's very difficult to know exactly what's going on in Syria, in part because it's always difficult to know exactly what's taking place in a very active war zone, especially when each side has foreign proxies that are supporting it and that are behind it, as is the case in the war in Syria. Obviously, any decent human being looks at what has happened to Syria over the past 6 years with horror and disgust, and it's one of the world's greatest humanitarian tragedies. At the same time, the fact that something is taking place that is heinous and awful doesn't mean that any solution that's proposed will actually make it better. Oftentimes, the solutions that are proposed make things worse. And so I don't pretend to have the answers for how to resolve the conflict in Syria, but what I do know is that every time Western governments proclaim that they're going to militarily intervene in other countries in the name of humanitarianism, exactly the opposite results happen. They make things worse in all instances, or virtually all instances, from a humanitarian perspective. And I don't think that should be surprising, because the reason the U.S. government spends more than the next 12 nations combined on its military is not because it wants to spread freedom and democracy around the world. Humanitarianism is not actually the motive for that. And the reason NATO exists and occasionally, or more than occasionally, starts wars and bombs people is not because they're trying to bring freedom and democracy to people around the world who are suffering under tyranny. The reason those things exist is because that is what bestows power on Western nations to let them manipulate the world for their own interest. And that's always going to be what Western intervention is about. Humanitarianism is the pretext. It's the costume. It's the dressing in which it's wrapped up. So no matter what your views on Syria are, no matter who you think are the primary culprits, the one thing I know for certain is that U.S. military action which, by the way, would be led by the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, whose name is Donald Trump, is not going to make things better for people in Syria.
So let's switch to other regions in the Middle East. Let's talk about Gaza and Yemen particularly. How would you compare the reaction that happens in Syria in contrast to these two places? Let's start with Gaza.
So there's this really interesting paradox that I think we see in Western discourse all the time, which is that atrocities committed by allies of Western governments are typically ignored or worse, justified, whereas atrocities committed by enemies of the United States and NATO are screamed about and protested and highlighted. And so if the Russians drop a bomb in Syria that kills civilians, that generates intense media coverage and denunciation. But if the Saudis bomb, as they so often do, civilian facilities in Yemen on purpose that kill scores of women and children and innocent men, and particularly even more so when the Israelis just shoot unarmed protesters in the head or the back using snipers, there's very little coverage of that and even less denunciation. And, you can actually, I guess, make the argument that if you're a citizen of a Western country, you ought to be condemning both of those equally. You ought to be condemning when the Russians kill people equally to when the United States and its allies do. But to me, actually, I think there's a much more compelling moral principle, which is that we ought to be most concerned about the evil committed not by governments thousands of miles away from us over which we exercise no influence, for which we have no responsibility, and which we cannot change, but our own governments who are engaging in these atrocities in our name. And so as an American citizen and as an American journalist, it isn't that I value certain lives over other lives. I ask myself the question, what is it that I can do the most about? And what I can do the most about is my own government support for incredibly tyrannical and murderous governments like the one in Saudi Arabia and like the one in Israel. And we have utterly reversed that because that's what propaganda is. Propaganda is about convincing a citizenry that your side is the moral one and the other side is the immoral one. And the way you accomplish that is by ignoring the atrocities committed by your own side. What Saudi Arabia is doing in Yemen, I think, is probably the worst humanitarian atrocity. And what the Israelis have done to the Palestinians, people in Gaza specifically, over the last 5 to 6 decades is probably the greatest moral atrocity of the last half of the 20th century and early part of the 21st century. And the United States government, and for that matter, your government in Munich and governments throughout Western Europe are directly responsible for all of that because they support and protect and enable and empower the governments that are responsible for that, and that ought to be our main focus.
I want to talk about Russia, and specifically about Russiagate, and you've done a great deal of work exposing the debacles of corporate media and their false reporting about Russian interference in the election. There was a great amount of concern in Germany as well as France about Russian interference. It didn't turn out to be true. The director of the Digital Society in Germany said nothing happened. In France, it was the same case by the head of the cybersecurity. Basically, Russia did nothing. But yet, Germany is increasing its military presence. It's actually taking a role in trying to increase its military budget, trying to reach this 2% target of NATO, and also talking about placing its presence in the Eastern Bloc, which basically means, in other words, in front of Russia's nose. So could you talk about Russiagate and the implications it has on democracy and our society?
So it's hard for me to express to people who don't live in the United States and who don't follow United States political debate on a daily basis just how utterly insane and deranged Americans have become about Russia. The person to whom you just spent the last hour listening, Dr. Jill Stein, is widely regarded not by fringe lunatics in American politics, but by the most mainstream political and media figures in both parties to be a Russian agent. Like, they actually think she works for the Kremlin. That's how completely insane they've become. And if you ask them for evidence for that, they'll say that she once went to a dinner in Moscow that Putin attended for about 6 minutes, along with dozens of other international peace activists around the world. This kind of guilt by association and this kind of hysteria and conspiracy that drove the entire Cold War when it came to American propaganda about Moscow has reared its head, but in a much, I think, more toxic and irrational way, because there was actually a communist movement in the latter half of the 20th century that was the opposite of what the American philosophy was, and they were two huge major countries opposing one another around the world. Russia is nothing like that. Russia is the 8th largest economy in the world. It's actually just behind Italy. It has very few global ambitions beyond its immediate neighborhood. To try and convince people that Russia poses some sort of grave threat to the West to the point where we need to build our military budgets up is insanity, but it's exactly what Western political discourse has become. If you look at the insanity of it in Germany, I think it becomes particularly vivid. I mean, there were two of the most horrific wars fought in the 20th century because of tensions between Germany and Russia. The Cold War came close to virtually annihilating the species because of tensions between Moscow and Washington, countries that continue to have thousands of nuclear-tipped missiles pointed at one another's cities using very archaic Cold War trigger systems that can easily go off through misperception and miscommunication. So the idea of playing games with tensions between Russia and Western countries, especially given how NATO has virtually encircled Russia by moving all the way up to its eastern borders, exactly how NATO promised not to do when Gorbachev agreed to allow for the reunification of Germany. Very provocative behavior on the part of the West continually. It makes it extraordinary to watch American political discourse become obsessed with ratcheting up tensions. It's one of the most dangerous things I've ever seen, and it's also one of the most despicable, because the real reason for it, the real reason why this is happening, is because Democrats in Washington still cannot accept responsibility for the fact that they lost to a person who basically is a game show host. They don't want to do any kind of introspection about why they've collapsed as a national party. That's true of parties in Western Europe as well. It's always easiest to blame a foreign villain, to try and create a foreign monster that you get your population to focus on so that they forget about the problems and corruptions of your own country. And in the best of cases, it's a deceitful thing to do because it buries the real problems that we have. But when you're playing games with nuclear-armed powers that have a history of starting world wars and that came close to dropping nuclear bombs on one another, it's one of the most morally reprehensible things I've seen in my 12 years of covering politics as a journalist.
So what does the assumption that Trump somehow magically from his basement of his castle interfered through Twitter bots and everything and was able to bring Donald Trump in power, has Donald Trump enacted policies that have benefited Russia in any way?
Right. So, okay, first of all, let's just look at the premise of this for a second, right? So we hear constantly the overriding media narrative that Trump is a moron, that Trump is an idiot, that Trump probably has mental health problems, that he has dementia, that he barely even knows where he is, all of which are reasonable things to think if you pay attention to how he speaks and what he says. And so at the same time, the argument gets put beside that Vladimir Putin, this kind of global mastermind, decided to interfere in the U.S. election and needed Donald Trump to conspire and collude with him. I mean, if the Russians were going to interfere in the 2016 election, why would they need Donald Trump to help them? What possible services could he provide? What kind of aid and assistance could he do? Was he masterminding the hacking? Was he plotting how to distribute the information? The whole theory kind of collapses onto itself when you think about what it is that they're typically saying. But even if you look at what Trump has done since he's been in office, right? So the argument originally was that Trump was sort of captive to the Kremlin, in part out of gratitude for the fact that they helped him win, but also because the crazier people in American politics were saying that they actually have blackmail material over him. They have a videotape of him engaging in sexually incriminating acts and all kinds of fantasies that they got from television and movies and novels about the Cold War where the Russians blackmail people, and that Trump was essentially a puppet, literally, of Putin, that he pulls the strings and Trump does what he wants. Since Trump has been in office, he did something that Obama refused to do in Syria, which is bomb the Russians' client state in Syria. He has also done something much more important to the Russians, which Obama refused to do, which is arm anti-Russian elements in Ukraine with lethal weapons, something that Putin finds genuinely threatening and genuinely provocative. He has expelled Russian diplomats. He's imposed sanctions on oligarchs very close to the Kremlin and to Vladimir Putin. So if you were to try and find evidence for any of this, the idea that Trump is captive to Putin or that the Kremlin controls the White House now, not only would you find no evidence, what you would actually find is that Trump has been more confrontational with Moscow than Barack Obama was. Which I say not with any admiration, but with criticism. And I think a major part of the reason why is because the climate that has been created in Washington is such that, like with Jill Stein, unless you advocate dropping bombs on Moscow, you're going to be smeared as a Russian agent. And, you know, I always say this, and I guess there's a part of it that's exaggerated for dramatic effect, but I actually do genuinely believe it. The more evidence that you provide for any conspiracy theorist that their conspiracy theory is false, the more they're going to take that evidence and use it as proof their conspiracy theory is true. So every time Trump bombs Assad, they'll say, oh, Putin told them where to bomb. It didn't really do much. It didn't kill enough people for us to be convinced. When Trump provides lethal aid to Ukraine, they'll say Putin told him to do that to throw everyone off the track. I honestly think that if tomorrow Trump bombed Moscow, they would say, oh, Putin told them which targets to bomb. Because it's become this religion that anybody who dissents from American political orthodoxy, anybody who challenges the Democratic Party, and Donald Trump himself are basically controlled by this mastermind that is straight out of a James Bond movie named Vladimir Putin. And it's really become a sickness in the West that is smearing the reputation of people like Jill Stein, but also justifying massive military budgets and all kinds of very dangerous geopolitical policies around the world.
So let's get to some public questions. What can an average citizen do to avoid the invasion of his privacy?
Well, the good news about that is, as I said earlier, first of all, there are actually now internet services, including Facebook and Google, that do use greater encryption that does provide genuine protections for your privacy. So a lot of times you're using encryption without even realizing it. You know, to some extent, that was always the case. If you accessed your bank account, if you bought a plane ticket, you were using encrypted websites just by default. And that has become true now. If you pick up your telephone and message someone on WhatsApp or other services, then you're automatically protected by encryption. But there are still steps you can take beyond that that have become increasingly less difficult. There are telephone apps such as Signal and Telegraph that allow a good deal of privacy protection. There are ways to communicate and to browse the internet, such as the Tor browser. There are encryption programs on email. You know, 5 years ago when I was first contacted by Edward Snowden, you had to be a very sophisticated and advanced computer expert in order to use a lot of these programs. And I remember in 2015, Snowden in an interview said that the goal of the hacking community and the privacy community has to be to make these encryption tools meet the Glenn Greenwald standard, by which he means that basically any idiot has to be able to use them. And that is essentially what has happened. Increasingly, they're getting easier to use. And so every day it's easier for you to build a wall between your own privacy and your private communications and what you do on the internet and the ability of governments and non-state actors to be able to monitor what it is you're doing. And it's incumbent upon people whose jobs needs security and safety and confidentiality, like doctors and journalists and human rights activists, to use them, but also for ordinary citizens to just make it that much harder for governments around the world to use the internet as a spying tool.
So the next question, how can we break through the corporate news domination of our country? In brackets, meaning USA.
Well, it's interesting. I think that if you go back and look at some of the early commentary about the internet, why people were so excited about this incredible invention that really obviously is one of the most significant human innovations in centuries, one of the main reasons was that it would give human beings the power to disseminate information and communicate with one another without having to rely upon huge corporate institutions. And to some extent, that has not happened, in part because these corporate institutions now control and own the internet, as we were talking about before with Facebook and Google being so dominant, in part because of what made Edward Snowden come forward, which is the fact that governments around the world have turned the internet into this unprecedented means of coercion and control, as opposed to what the promise was, which is that it would be this unparalleled tool of liberation and democratization. But at the same time, it has actually empowered people around the world in ways that were previously unimaginable. I think the best example is the world's understanding of what Israel does do in Gaza. 10 years ago, when the Israelis would decide to just drop bombs indiscriminately on Gaza and slaughter civilians, they would allow only their favorite Western reporters working for large corporate media outlets into Gaza, who would immediately recite the line of the IDF that they only killed Hamas, or that they were bombing Hamas, or if they had bombed a school, it was because Hamas had turned it into just lies, blatant lies. And that was the only way we could get our information, was we had to rely upon the corporate media. Now, even a population purposely deprived, extremely poor, like Gazans, 1.8 million Gazans, have cell phones and internet upload links. And so when the Israelis randomly shoot protesters who are unarmed, or when they bomb schools, we see the footage of the truth. And it has changed how people think of the relationship between the Israelis and the Palestinians. It's much harder for Israel to lie to the world because they can no longer control what we're seeing about their actions the way they could just even 10 or 15 years ago as a result of the internet. And that's why, to me, fighting to keep the internet free, not asking corporations and governments to censor and control it, remains the central fight, because it does remain one of the most promising tools in human history for us to be able to organize together, to disseminate information, and to undermine and subvert the most powerful institutions. And the last thing we ought to be doing is asking those institutions to be increasing their control over the internet.
And the last question, could you talk about the piece where you talk about homelessness and dogs in Brazil, Rio de Janeiro? What culture has developed out of that?
Sure. I mean, this is a personal project for myself and my husband. We've been rescuing dogs for many years, and I think this is we have 24 of our own. I think this is the first speech I've ever given from my house where they weren't barking. People are going to complain about that because they love my dog barking. And about 5 years ago, we began focusing on the very substantial homeless population here in Rio de Janeiro, which lives on the street very frequently with their pets, and began noticing that the bond that forms between homeless people and their homeless animals is much more profound and much greater and much deeper than the average relationship of people who love their pets, in large part because neither have anything else and they have only each other. And there's now amazing social science research on this, proving that this is true. And so we recently decided we wanted to tap into that energy by developing a shelter that takes care of abandoned animals, but at the same time only employs homeless people who have lived on the streets and shown this love for animals. And so It's a project that's simultaneously caring for abandoned animals, but at the same time, employing homeless people, helping them open bank accounts, teaching them how to rent an apartment and then get off the street and then find permanent employment. It's a model that we hope to use around the world because it's helping two populations that typically are neglected, abandoned animals, and homeless people. And, I think it's very important that in your politics, that you embrace important principles of humanitarianism and peace. But at the same time, I think it's very important that those not stay abstract, that you practice those principles in your life as well. And the more we just find ways to spread those values just in small ways, the more the world will improve. And, I usually get asked at these kinds of functions, like, what is it that we can do to change these things? And for me, the answer is always focus first on your own individual behavior and ask what you can be doing more of to make the world a better place.
Glenn Greenwald, co-founder of The Intercept and investigative journalist, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for inviting me. Appreciate it. Thank you, everybody.
Welcome to The Source, a program dedicated to providing a platform to whistleblowers, investigative journalists, and policy experts. My name is Zan Raza. Today we're joined by Glenn Greenwald, an investigative journalist and the co-founder of The Intercept. In 2013, Glenn reported and published the highly classified NSA leaks exposed by whistleblower Edward Snowden. Glenn Greenwald, thanks for joining us again.
Thank you for having me.
So let's start with Edward Snowden. According to your Instagram, you visited him last year. Can you talk about how he's doing and his current and future status in Russia?
He's doing really well. Of course, everything is relative to what the expectation was when we were in Hong Kong working together, which was that he would end up in U.S. custody in a U.S. prison, probably a maximum security one for the next 50 years, if not the rest of his life. Given that instead he's free in Russia to travel around, most importantly to participate in the debate that he helped to provoke. He lives there with his longtime girlfriend. His family can visit. He's free in a much greater sense than we ever thought he would be, although, of course, he can't leave Russia because the U.S. government is still threatening to imprison him if he does. So if you look at it in the context of what the expectations were when he did what he did, I think he's doing remarkably well and is very, very happy.
Public opinion in Germany is quite positive on Snowden's work. The whole NSA leaks showed how the German population is even getting surveilled on by the NSA. However, the German government has refused up until this day. We, acTVism Munich, did an interview with him, but the German government has not done the same. So how do you assess the reaction of the German government in terms of how they treated Snowden?
I find it really despicable, to be honest. There are a lot of governments around the world that benefited immensely from the bravery of Edward Snowden, not just there in Germany, but here in Brazil, where I live, for example. There were incredible numbers of revelations showing how the U.S. and its partners, including in Canada and the UK, were spying on the industry of Brazil, the government of Brazil, the population of Brazil, just like in Germany, just like in lots of other Western European countries. And yet not a single country had the principle or the courage to do what it was required to do, not just by ethics, but convention, which was offer asylum to Edward Snowden to protect him from persecution at home other than Russia. And so I do think it reflects very poorly on these governments to have cashed in on all of the benefits that he offered them through his bravery, including Angela Merkel, who discovered all kinds of things about how she personally was being spied on, but then decided that it wasn't worth turning around and exhibiting even a fraction of the bravery that he showed in order to protect him from the persecution to which he's been subjected.
Why is his work, 6 years later almost, still significant today, and how can people personally support Edward Snowden?
Well, I think his work is significant because, notwithstanding how important the revelations were, the mass surveillance that he exposed still continues. And several different developments after his spying was revealed has, in some sense, accelerated the spying and even increased public support for it. I would say primarily all of the scare over ISIS and the related terrorist attacks in Western Europe, like in Paris and Brussels, and there's been some in Germany and the UK. And then probably even more so, the fear that Western governments have successfully instilled in Western populations regarding Russia and the threat that it poses to Western democracies, supposedly, even though it has an economy smaller than Italy's. They've kind of resuscitated and revived the Cold War script. So this is combined to increase in a lot of ways the idea that we want and need government spying in an indiscriminate way over the internet. But at the same time, you have private internet companies like Facebook and Google and Apple trying to demonstrate to their users that they're committed to protecting the privacy of their users so they don't lose the next generation of internet users to social media companies that promise greater privacy protection. You have individuals who are taking matters into their own hands by using greater degrees of encryption and other privacy tools far more than before. So I think that even 5-6 years after the revelations began, in one sense, there has been an increased threat to internet privacy. But on the other hand, there has been a lot of opportunity created by the reporting to create a wall between us and governments. And on top of that, you now have increasing awareness of the threat of private surveillance by the internet companies themselves. So I think the debate, the kind of war that Snowden helped to catalyze, very much is still unfolding.
Let's switch to Julian Assange. It was revealed by accident or error that the US government is planning on charging him. Can you A, talk about the significance of his case in terms of press freedoms, and B, how do you think the media and political establishment has treated him in comparison to other journalists that have been ill-treated by the Trump administration?
There's been a long effort to try and prosecute Julian Assange and WikiLeaks going back to the Obama administration that actually convened a grand jury that made it clear they wanted to be able to prosecute and indict him for what they regarded as the crimes of reporting information about what the U.S. government was doing in the dark, but ultimately concluded, the Obama administration did, that there was no way to do that without also prosecuting the New York Times or the Guardian or all of the other news organizations that either worked with WikiLeaks or that published the same secrets as it did, or that published similar or even more sensitive secrets. How do you justify criminalizing the act of publishing documents in the case of WikiLeaks, but then not prosecute the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the other ones? And so for that reason, the Obama administration, although it wanted to and made clear that it wished it could, decided that it wouldn't prosecute WikiLeaks. And at the time, the U.S. media seemed to be more or less on the side of WikiLeaks because they realized the threat that that kind of a prosecution could and would pose to themselves. Everything changed in terms of how the U.S. government views WikiLeaks and in terms of how the media views WikiLeaks after the 2016 election, because before it was perceived that WikiLeaks was exposing the war crimes of the Bush administration and had a lot of support on the left and among liberals as a result. But once 2016 happened and most of their reporting during that year was harmful to the candidate favored by most of the media, which is Hillary Clinton, and therefore helpful to Donald Trump, he lost almost all of his support on the left and even among the traditional media. And even though he gained some support on the right, it is still true that in a lot of ways, WikiLeaks is viewed as public enemy number one among the CIA, the Justice Department, the FBI, the NSA, even with Trump at the helm, they still view WikiLeaks as one of their main enemies because he's been spilling their secrets for years. And then the media support for him has more or less evaporated now that they see him not so much as a neutral whistleblower or an anti-Republican whistleblower, but as a pro-Trump whistleblower, or even as an arm of Russian intelligence, which is something they say with great regularity, notwithstanding the fact that there's no evidence for it. So all of that has changed how WikiLeaks is perceived. The Trump administration has made clear that it is a top priority of theirs to prosecute and extradite Julian Assange and WikiLeaks for the crime of what they regard as the crime of publishing documents. And it's going to be much harder to stop this time because he has very few allies across the political spectrum as opposed to 2011 when the Obama administration decided it couldn't do it.
Let's run some arguments that are usually voiced when it comes to WikiLeaks. You already, I'll state it even though you addressed it. For example, one of the arguments is he interfered in the political process, siding with the Trump administration. The second argument usually lies with there are hackers instead of publishers, and that they actively work with whistleblowers instead of just when the whistleblower comes to you and they do their job as a journalist. And the last part of the argument is he has too much power as a single person and publisher. Could you address these 3 points, please?
Sure. Half of them are lies and half of them make no sense. So let's start with the first one, which is the idea that he interferes in the political process. What journalist who covers an election doesn't interfere in the political process? Most American journalists were openly in favor of Hillary Clinton, constantly called Donald Trump a liar and a fascist every day that they opened their mouths, which was fully their right to do. The fact that they worked with the Clinton campaign, that they constantly dug up dirt on Trump, that they openly wanted the Democrats to win, doesn't, in my mind, make them any less of journalists. If someone were to prosecute them for publishing documents, I wouldn't stand up and say, oh, well, they were clearly in favor of one side or the other and therefore have lost their status as journalists. Journalists aren't required to remove themselves from the world or pretend to have no opinions in order to be journalists. Journalists have traditionally crusaded in favor of things that they thought were better for the world or against injustice. The New York Times published Donald Trump's tax returns, even though they had no idea who sent it to them, and even though sending tax returns and publishing tax returns without someone's authorization is a crime. They clearly did it to harm the Trump candidacy, but it was clearly an act of journalism, even though they were interfering in the election. Journalists interfere in elections all the time. It's called reporting. And the idea that, well, if you interfere in the election on the side of one candidate or another, you lose your status as a journalist is going to send a lot of journalists to prison. So it's a very dangerous theory, and it's one that actually makes no sense. The idea that WikiLeaks does more than merely work with whistleblowers, they actually collaborate or conspire with them to steal documents, is something for which no evidence has ever been presented. When I said earlier that the Obama administration wanted to prosecute WikiLeaks, that was exactly what they were hoping to be able to prove in order to distinguish WikiLeaks from, say, The Guardian or The New York Times. Namely, they were looking for evidence that WikiLeaks didn't just receive documents from Chelsea Manning, but actually collaborated with her prior to or during the hack in order to say that they were collaborators in the crime. And I know there were some efforts on the part of media figures to try and depict us, the reporters who worked with Edward Snowden, as being his collaborators in the same way, but no evidence was found of that. So you can accuse WikiLeaks all you want of collaborating with hackers or call them hackers, but until you have evidence that actually demonstrates that, all you're doing is fabricating and lying. And so it's not a very impressive theory to me. In the absence of evidence, the only evidence we have is that WikiLeaks does what every major media outlet does, which is receive information from sources and then reports on and publishes it. I think the main attack on WikiLeaks has been this idea that they have too much power, and along with that, they work with the Russian government. But again, I mean, for decades, the New York Times was the place where every major national security leak ended up. When Daniel Ellsberg gave the Pentagon Papers to the New York Times, that was the argument the Nixon administration used to try and get the Supreme Court to censor them, was why should the editor of the New York Times have so much power that he gets to decide which government secrets are published and which ones remain concealed? And the answer is that's what a free press does. You get information that powerful factions want hidden, and you then make choices about what's in the public interest to publish and what isn't. That also is called journalism. So if we're going to accept the theory that Julian Assange has too much power because he gets to make decisions about what's published and what isn't, then again, you're stripping away First Amendment or free press protections from every working investigative journalist, and I don't think that's something any of us want to do.
You mentioned Russian interference. Let's examine this topic a bit further. The German mainstream media is quite sold on the fact that the Russians interfered in the US elections, and they base it on two things: the intelligence assessment report of 2017 and the investigation which is being headed by former FBI Director Robert Mueller. But I want to specifically focus on the findings of the investigation that Robert Mueller is conducting. Could you talk about this investigation, and has it proven that Russia colluded with the Trump administration?
Well, so the Mueller investigation is about 1.5 years old, a little bit more than that. So far, not a single indictment of an American citizen for conspiring with Russians in connection with the 2016 election has resulted from that investigation. So the question that led to the Mueller investigation, which was, did Trump officials or other Americans criminally conspire with the Russians to interfere in the 2016 election? We don't know yet what the final answer of the Mueller probe is because it's not over. But what we do know is that no indictments have alleged, let alone proven, that any American, any Trump official actually did any of that. It's alleged that Russian officials interfered in the election through hacking and through social media activity. It's alleged that Americans committed crimes unrelated to the 2016 election, like Paul Manafort involved in money laundering and the like, or people lying to investigators after the election was over. But on the question that you asked me about, which is the question that was the reason there is a special counsel in the first place, namely, did anybody in the Trump campaign actively conspire with the Russians here in the 2016 election? Thus far, the Mueller probe has produced no indictments, no convictions, and no evidence relating to, let alone demonstrating any of that to be the case. I don't know what's going to happen in the future because I don't have a crystal ball, but I do know that ABC News' Jonathan Karl, who's the chief White House correspondent of ABC, just 4 days ago said that the Mueller report, when it comes, is highly likely to be anticlimactic, as he called it, because they haven't found any evidence and don't intend to allege any existence of this kind of collusion that you just asked me about.
You talked about the media, and I want to pick up on that. You frequently write stories about how the US media failed to back their stories up with evidence, even though they make huge claims about Russian interference in the initial phase. These stories usually lack evidence, don't follow journalistic standards, and in many cases they have to be redacted. This information, however, does not trickle down to the German media, and they always cite the initial claims made by something like Washington Post or CNN, MSNBC. So could you list one of the most influential stories that fell apart and also talk about why?
Well, it's funny that you asked that because we're talking 36 hours after one of the biggest stories completely blew up in the face of the US media, which was BuzzFeed on Thursday night reported a blockbuster bombshell that Robert Mueller has obtained emails and testimony proving that Donald Trump directed his longtime lawyer, Michael Cohen, to lie to Congress about the existence of a construction project in Moscow to build a Trump hotel or a Trump tower. This was treated as one of the biggest stories of the entire saga, which it would have been had it been true, because it would have meant that Donald Trump actively encouraged lying to Congress and the concealment of crucial information. Unfortunately for all of the people who touted it, and particularly for the people who reported it, Robert Mueller himself, who has been notoriously silent when it comes to media reports. He's barely ever uttered a peep, which is why he kind of gets treated as having godlike powers. He's sort of like the biblical God who just speaks once every 2,000 years from the mount. And so you just think that he has these kind of, this power of impotence, of omnipotence, since he barely ever speaks. But in this case, he came down from his mount to speak and said that actually the BuzzFeed report story was false. So Robert Mueller himself said that the BuzzFeed story, the crucial parts of it, were inaccurate in his words. And so after spending 36 hours hysterically claiming that this was the end of the Trump presidency, that he was likely to be impeached, that this is proof that he obstructed justice, the whole story fell apart. And this happened over and over and over and over again. It's funny because I'm working on, and probably will publish later today, if not tomorrow, what I think are the top 10 most humiliating media failures in the Trump-Russia story. And the hardest job that I have in writing this is there are so many excellent candidates that it's really hard to pick the 10 most humiliating ones. But, they've done things like they said, the Washington Post said that Russia invaded the U.S. electric grid and had the power to shut off electricity to people in winter. And the whole story turned out to be completely false. 6 months ago, CNN reported that they got an email proving that Donald Trump was offered advanced access to the WikiLeaks archive of emails before it was actually published. And for a full day, this was proof that WikiLeaks was in bed with the Trump campaign. And then they had to sheepishly admit that their sources had misread the date on the email. And in fact, the email was sent after the entire archive was made public. It was just some random person from the public telling Donald Trump Jr. to go look at what everybody else had already seen, not special advanced access, as CNN had claimed. There have been instances where CNN had to fire its own reporters for claiming that a top Trump aide had an involvement with a Russian investment bank under investigation that, in fact, he had no involvement with whatsoever. Maybe my personal favorite story is about 4 months ago. There was this mystery in Cuba where a variety of U.S. diplomats, what they call U.S. diplomats, but who are in fact, of course, spies stationed in Havana, were suffering from headaches and other psychological conditions that everybody claimed was due to a very strange sonic noise that was heard outside of the embassy that they speculated was an advanced sonic weapon using microwaves. And MSNBC, NBC went on the air and said that they've been told for certain that the people behind this sonic attack that was so sophisticated that the Pentagon couldn't even understand the weapons that were used were the Russians. But then just about a week ago, it turned out that scientists analyzed the sounds that had been recorded that were the mysterious, high-level, super-duper sophisticated sonic weapons and matched them to the noises that are emitted by a well-known Caribbean cricket during mating season. So over and over and over again, it's the kind of reporting that basically led to the American public believing that Saddam Hussein had nuclear weapons, that he was in an alliance with al-Qaeda, and even that he participated in the planning of the 9/11 attacks. And over and over and over, these stories have fallen apart because they are published with no evidence, simply because intelligence officials who are trained to lie, who are born to lie, tell these media officials to go say it, and they obediently go and say it. And then it reverberates all around the world. And as you say, I watched this happen in Brazil as well. The initial fake reports get massive amounts of coverage. And then the retractions, although they're humiliating for the U.S. journalists and the U.S. media outlets, get almost no attention anywhere else in the world. In fact, if you look at the people who tweet these fake stories, they get 30 to 40,000 retweets. They get double the Twitter following count as a result. And then when, in the cases when they post the retraction, a lot of times they don't. Maybe the retraction gets 50 or 100 retweets.
How does the media react to it? And also, what can the public do to hold the media accountable when they have such shortcomings and they perhaps do not own up to their shortcomings?
It's a really interesting dynamic because President Trump has made as one of his main themes attacks on the U.S. media. He frequently refers to them as fake news and the lying media and the like. And U.S. media outlets are very, very adept at acting with extreme levels of melodramatic outrage whenever they're called fake news. They declare these insults to be a grave enemy, threat to democracy. They have a very kind of well-rehearsed script that they read from whenever they get insulted. So they spend a lot of time expressing indignation and anger and rage and offense and insult whenever they're accused of spreading fake news. But they spend almost no time, unfortunately, asking themselves why those attacks resonate, why faith in media institutions have collapsed, why Donald Trump thinks it's a good strategy to turn the media into his enemy. And the reason is you've gone through the United States is a country that went through the 2002, 2003 lies over not just the Iraq War, but torture and rendition in Guantanamo. They went through 2008, where all of the geniuses that they were told were such great custodians of the economy presided over an economic collapse that to this very day is causing massive amount of suffering. There's a general loss of faith in the ruling class institutions, not just in the US, but obviously in Western Europe, as we see with Brexit, with the rise of extremist parties in Germany and in France, the Yellow Vest movement that's kind of non-ideological, but just sort of angry at the status quo. You see the same thing here in Brazil, where a far-right leader just got elected in a country that had previously been electing left-wing leaders, not because there's been a change in ideology, but because there's been a collapse in faith in the ruling class for good reasons. And the ruling class seems to be responding, including the media class, by calling everybody names who expresses the satisfaction, but spending very little time engaged in self-critique or self-analysis. And until they start figuring out what it is that they're doing that's causing a lot of these political developments, I think they're only going to continue to get worse.
So how can the public play a role here in your perception? Should they just start boycotting the news, or should they consume more of independent journalism, or what can an individual do to make sure that the media is held accountable?
I mean, I think the public is boycotting the media, which is why there's a proliferation of news sites all over the internet, which in one way has an understandable impetus to it, which is they no longer believe these large media outlets for good reason. On the other hand, they can drive them into the arms of outlets that are at least just as deceitful and have malicious intent. And so I think the number one duty of a citizen is to make certain that no matter who it is that's telling you something, no matter how much you think they're trustworthy, no matter how politically aligned they are with you, that you not believe things until you see actual evidence for them. That if a government makes a claim, don't be satisfied to put your faith or trust in that political official as though they're a figure of the church, unless they show you the documentary evidence that you can look at and evaluate and see for yourself. When you read something online, don't believe it unless there's evidence presented for it. I think the most important thing is for citizens to develop and apply critical thought processes to everyone and everything. And I think as long as they continue to do that, the ability of people to deceive and mislead will gradually weaken.
To my last question, the political landscape is quite difficult in modern times for activists and journalists. On one end, you have Donald Trump, for example, in power, where he's causing immediate suffering, for example, separating children from their parents at the border, or all these strikes that are happening in Iraq and Syria. But on the other hand, you have this thing that we should be talking about more, which you argue about the conditions that led to Donald Trump, and what were the factors in the past that played to this. And you also warned that Donald Trump might get, another worse Donald Trump might come into power. So how should people that have limited time, and journalists and activists, how should they be balancing immediate suffering and long-term thinking?
I think it's a hard question, because the temptation is to say we don't really have the luxury of thinking long-term when we have a president doing a lot of the horrible things that you've just been describing. The reality, though, is that he won the election, and he's going to be in office absent some extremely unexpected development for another 2 years. And it's not just Donald Trump, it's people ideologically aligned with him around the world who are either winning or close to winning elections. The UK is about to pull out of the EU for reasons similar to the reasons Trump won. Marine Le Pen and the Le Pen movement in France is strengthening, especially as Macron, the one person who stopped her, is weakening further. Here in Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro just won using similar themes. So unless we start asking ourselves, what is it about the ruling class philosophy of neoliberalism and militarism that is making so many people so desperate and angry that they're turning to extremists and charlatans and con artists and frauds, as long as they're just positioned outside of the power structure? Until we start asking ourselves that question in a very honest and constructive way to figure out how to change it, we can stomp our feet all we want. We can call everybody racist who are supporting these people or fascists. We can march in the street if we want. But as long as we have democracy and support an ideology that is destroying the futures of tens of millions of people, they're going to continue to vote in ways that we don't like. And although it might be more satisfying to call people names or to denounce people using very harsh labels, it just doesn't seem to me very constructive. And so if the idea is to figure out how to stop this movement, then necessarily one has to evaluate the alternative and the flaws in that alternative and how to make it more appealing and more attractive.
Glenn Greenwald, investigative journalist and the co-founder of The Intercept, thank you so much for your time.
Great to be with you. Thanks for having me again.
And thank you guys for joining us today. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel and to donate, because if you don't, we won't be able to produce independent and non-profit news and analysis. My name is Zain Raza. See you guys next time. Thank you guys for tuning in today, and welcome to another episode of The Source. I'm your host, Zain Raza, and today I'll be talking to Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Glenn Greenwald. Glenn is the journalist who published the highly classified NSA leaks exposed by whistleblower Edward Snowden. He's the author of numerous books, the latest being Securing Democracy, My Fight for Press Freedom and Justice in Brazil. Glenn, welcome back to the show. It's been a while. How are you and how's everything in Brazil?
Well, things are great with me. Thank you for asking. It's always great to talk to you. Things in Brazil are complicated as always. There's an election rapidly approaching in October of next year that should be very interesting. So yeah, but things are generally good, and I hope that's the case on your end as well.
All good here in Germany, except we're heading to another lockdown, but that's exactly the issue that I wanted to talk to you, start off with. So last year when we talked in May 2020, the coronavirus was still fresh. It was hardly to accurately assess the situation. Back then I specifically asked you about civil liberties, and you stated, and I'm paraphrasing here, that although the government can be justified in some of its measures to ensure the protection of health and safety for its citizens, it is vital for citizens to remain vigilant during these times, as these laws could become permanent. By the way, just as a side note, the video that I'm referring to was immediately taken down by YouTube. Anyways, getting back to the issue, now almost 19 months later, we're seeing a completely different landscape. In many countries, digital vaccine IDs have been implemented that involve the corporate sector. We are seeing measures such as COVID passports and vaccine mandates being instituted. In Germany, for example, restrictions to many public jobs or services are being expanded to only vaccinated or those who have recovered from COVID-19. Chomsky even stated that unvaccinated people should voluntarily isolate themselves, and food supplies is their own problem. In essence, for good or bad reason, we have a divided society. What is your assessment of the situation now? Is the government justified, or do you think it has gone too far?
I think I would say that with any kind of questions involving a conflict between public safety on the one hand and civil liberties or government power on the other, a good framework to use is what happened after 9/11, in part because it was such a vivid example from which we've all learned so many lessons. Maybe it's also because it was the event that propelled me to leave the practice of law and start writing about politics. And so it's the starting point I use. But what happened there, I think, is very instructive, which is there really was an actual threat that was invoked to justify what was done after 9/11. The threat of terrorism was real. There were 2 passenger jets flown into 2 enormous office buildings in downtown Manhattan. It killed 3,000 people. Another was flown into the Pentagon. There was a fourth that was shot down. There have been terrorist attacks over the years that have involved mass casualties in the United States and outside. So it wasn't that the threat was fake. It wasn't that it was not something we should be concerned about. The question was, are we allowing the government to go too far in exaggerating the threat and claiming powers for too long a period of time that exceed the actual threat? And I think most of us concluded the answer was yes. And so many of the things that happened right after 9/11 that we were told were going to be temporary just until the crisis was controlled, things like the Patriot Act, but many other examples as well, are still with us 20 years later, even though there's basically no more Al-Qaeda, Osama bin Laden is dead, ISIS is defeated. So I think the lesson is that once you empower governments and states and officials and other power centers to obtain authorities in the name of fighting a particular threat or crisis, they don't go away. And here we are at the end of 2021 now. The interview we did was 18 months ago, and not only are all of those powers I was worried about back then still with us, we're talking about even greater powers still, more lockdowns, talking about people who refuse to comply with health protocols, being separated from society, denied jobs, and denied the right to travel. And what's amazing about that is when we did our interview, and I was worried back in June or whatever it was of 2020, there was no vaccine, there were no treatments, we understood very little about the virus. Here we are 18 months later, where by far the most important thing that has changed is that there's a vaccine that's universally available that really does protect you against serious sickness and death in almost all cases. And yet there's almost like no recognition that that is a very significant change. And I think that shows you that a lot of times this inertia just continues on its own. As for the question of how we treat the unvaccinated and the Chomsky idea that they ought to be basically put in camps, that's more or less what he said. They ought to be isolated and shunned and just prevented from doing anything other than leaving this physical space. And then kind of at the end, he said, I guess we should bring them food the way we bring prisoners food. But other than that, they should be denied every right and every privilege. I think it makes no sense from any kind of perspective of morality or ethics or science for 2 reasons. One is that if you believe in the efficacy of the vaccines, as I do, I believe that my being vaccinated protects me from serious illness, let alone death. There's no reason why I should view the unvaccinated as a danger or as a threat. To whom are the unvaccinated a danger? If you believe in the vaccine, they're not a danger to vaccinated people. So why do you need to fire them and punish them and put them in camps? Secondly, if you're worried about people transmitting the virus to you, we know that people who are vaccinated often do contract COVID anyway and transmit COVID. There's more and more breakthrough cases. I think in several states in the United States, 25% of all COVID deaths are vaccinated people. It stands to reason that even a higher percentage of the cases are vaccinated people. So given that vaccinated people can get and transmit the virus to us along with the unvaccinated, what is the reason we ought to continue to look at the unvaccinated as these threats, as these people who need to be punished and deprived basic rights? I think it's really become this kind of like almost punitive approach, like this almost religious fervor that people who are vaccinated are clean and blessed and good, and the people who disobey and don't get the vaccine are sinful, are dirty, are disease carriers. Really dangerous kind of rhetoric. If you look at how that rhetoric has been used in history, and it's increasingly concerning me.
Many progressive organizations in Germany's primary task is to weigh the pros and cons of government policies, have voiced little to no concern when it comes to the cons. In other words, the negative effects on society due to the government lockdown or vaccine mandates. On your platform, you looked at the history of government public vaccine campaigns, voluntarily and forced mandates. What were you able to uncover?
So I think that if you look, politicians who have been in favor of vaccine mandates and implement them in various cities bizarrely celebrate the success in the sense that if you tell people the only way they can keep their jobs in the middle of a pandemic is if they obey, there's going to be a large number of people who obey because they're afraid of losing their jobs and not being able to support their family. That makes sense. That kind of coercion might work in the sense that you get people to do what you want, but it's
a very brute tool. It's a really coercive weapon to tell people that the only way they're allowed to have a job or travel or leave their homes is if they obey the health mandates of the state. So, you could round up every citizen if you want who's unvaccinated and forcibly vaccinate them. That would get the population to 100% vaccinated. But I don't hear many people favoring that because we realize that there has to be a balance between people's liberty and the public health. And as I said before, given that I don't see any reason any longer to view the unvaccinated as a danger in a post-vaccinated world, what is the rationale to force people to take a vaccine, whether it's physically using the police to inject their arms or against their will, or being almost as coercive by telling them that they can't work if they don't take the vaccine? It doesn't make a lot of sense to me. It might work, as I said, in the sense that you get people to comply, just like sending the police to their house would work. But I think it's a really grave infringement of people's liberty to force them to inject into their bodies a substance that they don't want. There may be times when it's justified if it's a highly contagious disease that cannot be transmitted by people who are vaccinated, but that's not the case here. Or if it's a disease for which there's no effective vaccine, you could force people to engage in public health measures to avoid contaminating other people. That's also not the case. So yeah, I'm becoming increasingly worried about this coercive mentality, which, as I said before, we're creating new bureaucracies. If you look at every university, every company, they now have 5 to 10 to 20 COVID officials, Office of COVID Management. Once you start creating bureaucracies like that, it never goes away. So even if tomorrow there was an actual cure for COVID, you could easily see these bureaucracies turning into, say, the Office of Infectious Diseases and continuing to assert the same powers in the name of public health generally, maybe the flu, maybe other coronaviruses. I think what we're doing is very reactionary, and I think it's being done by telling people they can't look at the other side of the ledger, that the only thing that counts is avoiding COVID, and all of the other costs that come from things like school shutdowns and societal disruptions, we shouldn't assign those any value.
In Germany, your opinion would be perceived by many who support government policies as being anti-vax, and therefore immediately fall into the conspiracy theory realm. In the worst case, you could be labeled as supporting an opinion that is killing or promoting the far right, killing people or promoting the far right. Can you talk about the term anti-vax, the doublespeak involved, and what it actually means or should mean?
Yeah, it's bizarre. I'll just give you I'll use myself as an example, but then I'll give you another one. I went on many shows, some left-wing shows, some right-wing shows before I was vaccinated, while I was waiting for the vaccine to be available in Brazil for people of my age. And I said every single time I went on shows, including Fox News, that I believe in the vaccine, that I intend to be vaccinated the first day it's available for me, that I encourage other people to be vaccinated when they in fact ask me for my opinion. When I was vaccinated, I went on social media and those same shows and I said, I've now been vaccinated and I got my first dose, I got my second dose, I got my booster. So I'm somebody who has been vaccinated, who has repeatedly affirmed my belief in the science of vaccines, who has publicly encouraged others to be vaccinated, and yet I can't tell you how many times I've been labeled anti-vax because I don't believe that the state should be forcing other people to be vaccinated. It's similar to people claiming that if you believe someone should have the right to express an opinion, it must mean that you share that opinion. I think most rational people have come to understand that defending the right of somebody to express a certain opinion doesn't signify you agree with that opinion. It's obviously the same in this case. The fact that I don't support forcing people to be vaccinated doesn't mean I'm against the vaccine. It means that I believe in the right to choose. For me, and my own view is that I very much believe in the science of vaccines. And just recently in the UK, we had a very similar example with Jeremy Corbyn, one of the most admired and beloved figures politically on the left internationally, who came out against two different measures sponsored by the Conservative government of the United Kingdom, by the Tory Prime Minister Boris Johnson, one of which was to force public healthcare workers to be vaccinated or to lose their jobs, and the other was to require vaccine passports for anyone who wants to enter large events. And Corbyn was opposed to both, in part because the unions, which he listens to, as he should, as any leftist would, said, we don't believe our workers who have been on the front line fighting this virus for the last 18 months should be forced to get a vaccine. Some of them have natural immunity from having gotten COVID. Some of them are young, but they should not have their jobs conditioned on getting a vaccine. Jeremy Corbyn is somebody who has gotten vaccinated publicly. He's done public service announcements urging people to get vaccinated, and yet he now too is being called anti-vax simply by virtue of opposing this forced obligatory government power. I think what's extra ironic about it is that I think the people who are anti-vax are the people who keep insisting that we can't return to normal, who keep insisting that we need the government to fire everybody who's not vaccinated. The reason why I think we're ready to return to greater normalcy, the reason why I don't look at the unvaccinated as threats to me is precisely because I believe in the vaccine. I believe the vaccine protects me from COVID. I actually believe that. That's why I got the vaccine. That's why I encouraged others to get it. The people who seem to me to be disseminating an anti-vax message are the people who keep saying we can't go back to normal yet. We have to keep schools closed. We have to restrict travel. We have to treat the unvaccinated as dangers. They're the ones who seem to be saying that they don't really believe in the vaccine and its ability to keep us safe. And they go around calling everybody anti-vax as like a weapon. You know, it reminds me a lot of the way people call everyone who criticizes Israel anti-Semitic as a weapon to force them into agreement. That's how anti-vax is used. Anyone who disagrees with me is anti-vax. I think I have the most pro-vaccine message, not just because, like Jeremy Corbyn, I got vaccinated, I'm encouraging others to get it, but because all of my policy views on how we should treat the pandemic are based in the view that the vaccine works.
Usually the left, even if they supported certain government policies, always kept its criticism on corporate influence and structure that influence its policies. So just to quote some random examples, even though leftists don't advocate against driving trains or using cell phones or laptops, they voice criticisms on corporations that produce these goods. And the similar thing is with this vaccine. I mean, there's one thing to talk about the science, and there's one thing to talk about the corporations that are producing the vaccine. And if I take it one step further, when a natural disaster like COVID occurs, market conditions naturally change, which could lead to the formation of natural monopolies, oligopolies, cartels. Leftists would traditionally, in this case, argue for the government to step in, nationalize these industries to ensure that no exuberant profits are made and that power does not accumulate in the hands of a few corporations that could lead to more political power. However, in the case of COVID, we see the left totally silent on these parts of the political economy and developments of big pharmaceutical companies. And if you now criticize these big pharmaceutical companies, you're calling conspiracy theories. No differentiation is made between the goods produced and the political and economic structures behind these big pharmaceutical companies. Why do you think the left is so afraid and has abandoned its criticism of the political economy surrounding big pharma and the immense power it has accumulated?
It's a great question. It reminds me a lot of what happened during the Trump years, when the entire scandal that dominated the headlines for 4 years in the United States and parts of Western Europe about the threat from Russia, about the collusion between Trump and Russia, emanated from the CIA. It was a CIA-created story. They're the ones who leaked it. They're the ones who disseminated it in partners with the NSA and other security state agencies. And yet in major parts of the left, it became off limits to express skepticism of that story. You weren't allowed to express skepticism of claims emanating from the CIA or even question their intentions. The hero of the left became this former director of the FBI, Robert Mueller, who was George Bush's FBI director after 9/11. He was the one who rounded up Muslims in the United States. He was the one who advocated for the invasion of Iraq, claiming that there was definitive evidence of these were the people who we were told we had to get behind and cheer for, and that questioning them was off limits. Now you have Pfizer and Moderna, some of the largest pharmaceutical companies in the world. And I'm not saying we should immediately discount what they're saying, but we should recognize that they have an enormous profit motive in not only hyping the vaccine and all of its benefits, but now insisting that not just the 2 shots we were originally told were needed to make us fully vaccinated, but the 3rd booster, the 4th booster, what's certainly going to be the 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, and 9th, are all necessary as well to be considered fully vaccinated. The question you asked me before about how we treat the unvaccinated, if you know, 3 months ago, the unvaccinated meant something different than it means today. The unvaccinated 3 months ago meant somebody who has not gotten 2 shots. Now it means someone who has not gotten 2 shots plus the booster. 3 months from now, it's going to mean somebody who hasn't gotten 4 shots. And there seems to be almost no space on the left to wonder whether or not claims that are emanating from big pharmaceutical companies and their allies in the public health and scientific industry are to be doubted or questioned. And also what you pointed out, that this during the pandemic, the story of the pandemic has been that the largest corporations have consolidated their wealth. You know, you can use any metric. The top 200 billionaires in the world have had their wealth tripled or quadrupled because the largest corporations, which they founded and owned, like Amazon and Google and the rest, have all grown dramatically because of our reliance on them, while small businesses have increasingly disappeared as a result of lockdowns and quarantines and economic disruption. So the oligarchy that we already had prior to the pandemic is infinitely stronger than it was 2 years ago as a result of all these restrictions. We're becoming weaker and weaker in terms of our ability to challenge these corporate giants. And yet the ethos seems to be, don't question any of that. Our enemies are not big corporations, big pharma, big government, or the security services. Our enemies are, you know, ordinary citizens who, for whatever reason, don't want to get the vaccine. Those are the people we're supposed to hate and focus on. And for everybody else, obedience, submission, and gratitude are what we owe. And it seems to be a very aggressive inversion of leftist values to me.
I want to switch gears here and now focus on Julian Assange. Before I start digging deeper into the topic, I just want you to talk about how culpable is the media in today's the result that has come out that Julian Assange will be extradited to the United States. What role have they played so far?
Well, so a lot of you probably know that during the Trump years, one of the main concerns the media expressed was whether press freedoms would be attacked by Donald Trump. The Washington Post, very early on in the Trump presidency, adopted a new motto, a corporate motto that appears at the top of the page that says democracy dies in darkness. There were a lot of claims that Trump was a great threat to press freedoms because he would often be critical of the press. He would insult the media. He called the press the enemy of the people. The gravest threat to press freedom that happened during the Trump presidency, by far, not even close, was the indictment of Julian Assange, where they're trying to charge him with 18 felony counts under the Espionage Act, the same law they used against Edward Snowden, the same law they used against Daniel Ellsberg, the leaker of the Pentagon Papers in 1971, to say that he committed crimes in connection with the publication of those documents provided to him by Chelsea Manning in 2010. It doesn't have anything to do with the 2016 election or his role in that, at least formally. There's nothing in the indictment that has anything to do with that. But the argument is that by publishing those documents and working the way he did with Chelsea Manning, he became a criminal. So the theory used to criminalize him, if adopted, would essentially criminalize all investigative journalism, because everything he said to have done that makes him a criminal, namely helping Chelsea Manning try and evade detection, encouraging Chelsea Manning to provide more documents, soliciting materials from the public, and encouraging people to hand over classified information, are things investigative journalists, if they're good, do all of the time. I talked before about how the first article I ever wrote about the dangers of the Assange indictment was in May of 2019. In June of 2019, I, with my colleagues in Brazil, started a year-long investigative expose of showing the corruption on the part of high-level officials in the Bolsonaro government. And in January of 2020, I was criminally indicted by the Brazilian government using exactly the same theory the U.S. government was using to, and is using, to prosecute Assange. The Supreme Court intervened in my case and essentially issued a ruling that said that would be a violation of my press freedom. That's the only reason I'm not arrested and in prison, is because of that ruling. But this theory is incredibly dangerous to anyone around the world who does journalism. And remember, one of the things that makes it extra dangerous is Julian Assange is not an American citizen. He's not on U.S. soil. The U.S. is reaching across the world to try and nab him and bring him back to the United States, a country to which he has no connection, which I presume means that if the New York Times publishes secret documents from Iran, as it's done, or Russia or China, any of those governments under this theory would have the right to extradite those reporters to their countries and charge them with harming national security or espionage. And yet you hear almost no complaints, no concerns, no warnings from the American media. They were hysterical every time Trump would tweet an insult about some TV personality, as though that was a grave attack on press freedom. Here you have an actual attack on press freedom. Some of them, when Trump did it, came out in defense of Assange. But now that it's the Biden administration that has picked up this case and is aggressively pursuing it and refuses to drop it, there's almost no coverage of the case at all, let alone denunciations about what the Biden administration is doing, because the American media hates Julian Assange so much. They hate him for personality reasons. They hate him because of jealousy that he's broken so many stories more than they ever have or will. They hate him because they perceive that he helped Trump in the 2016 election by reporting accurately on Hillary Clinton. So the hatred level for Julian Assange is so great that almost nobody in the American media is even covering the story, let alone objecting. And that, of course, is a major reason why the U.S. government is getting away with trying to drag him back to the United States and keep him in prison forever.
So Julian Assange was spied upon while he was in the Ecuadorian embassy. In addition, there were plans discussed by the CIA and other government actors to assassinate him. Lastly, the star witness of the US, who has a documented history of several convictions for sexual abuse of minors and even for committing financial fraud, admitted to fabricating key accusations against Assange. These facts received little to no attention in the German media when the verdict came. It was just presented very objectively. So in your assessment, why do you think these facts were not given the weight that they deserved in the British court? So for example, if Navalny was tried in Russia and all of these things were done by the Russian government, we would have seen a big coverage and weightage put on these facts. Why do you think these developments were just simply thrown out by the British court?
You know, it's amazing. I visited Julian Assange in, I believe it was 2018 in the Ecuadorian embassy in London. I visited him as a journalist. I visited him with my husband, David Miranda, who's an elected member of the Brazilian Congress, who's a member of the Foreign Relations Committee, and was traveling on a diplomatic Brazilian passport to London. We went there to do an event together about what happened at Heathrow Airport during the Snowden reporting to David, and we went and visited the embassy, and we were among the people who were spied on by this private contractor hired by the CIA, as were many other people. An incredible breach of diplomatic protocols, of press freedom, of privacy. Beyond that, you know, he is suffering greatly inside of that embassy, or inside the prison where he is. His doctors have said that his physical and mental health are deteriorating rapidly, and yet there's very little coverage of it. And what you have instead is the American media, the German media, the British media. They love to accuse other countries of attacking journalists. They love to talk about what Putin has done to Navalny, what China has done to journalists, all of which may be true. But what standing, moral credibility does the United States and the UK have to condemn other countries for punishing journalists or attacking press freedoms, when the person who I would argue is one of the most consequential journalists of our generation, if not the most consequential, is imprisoned by both of those governments, maltreated in every way imaginable, his basic human rights and political rights violated for years with almost no objection. It's, you know, something that every other country in the world will just laugh at when the US and the UK pretend to be able to denounce other countries for attacks on press freedom, and they should be laughed at because they are among the worst violators.
An organization called Project Veritas was searched by the FBI for their adversarial work on Biden. Assange is now being extradited to the US for his work with WikiLeaks. We are not only seeing governments going after publishers, but we can see the same trend in the corporate sphere. So let's say YouTube, Twitter, Facebook. content is being deleted or removed of independent and alternative media outlets, whether it's critical of Biden or Corona policies, etc. So for example, acTVism Munich, we used to grow every year by thousands and thousands and thousands of subscribers. This is the first year, even though we've produced more videos than last year, where we have won 0 subscribers. And something has changed in the algorithms. We don't know what it is. In light of this, as a constitutional lawyer, I would like to ask you what free speech and press freedom actually means. Is it reserved for only institutional press and credentialed journalists, or does the definition go beyond?
So obviously, American law is different than other countries' laws, but in the United States, where press freedom was first protected by a constitution, a lot of people mistakenly believe, or have been purposely misled to believe, that the right of press freedom is available only to this small, professionalized, privileged group of people called journalists. So oftentimes, if you say that the prosecution of Assange is an attack on press freedom, as I said earlier, you'll be met with the objection, well, Julian Assange isn't a journalist, and therefore it can't be a case of press freedoms being attacked. I have no idea how people decide that Julian Assange isn't a journalist, given that, as I said earlier, he's broken more major stories than all of his critics combined. It looks to me like what he does is classic journalism. He gets information in the public interest from a source that's secret and then goes and publishes it so that the public can understand what their governments or other power centers are doing. That, to me, seems to be classic journalism. But ultimately, who does the left trust to decide who is and isn't a journalist? I mean, who decides that? Is it the U.S. government? They get to say that person's a journalist, that one's not. But I don't trust any institution to decide that. But the much more important point is that press freedom, as it was understood at the time that the Constitution was enacted, was never intended to apply only to a small group of privileged people, like some small priesthood of licensed credentialed journalists. It was a right that was available to all citizens. In fact, what it really meant, people who were using the press, the reason it's called the press is they were literally using a printing press, mimeographic machines and the like, that colonists in the United States, like Thomas Paine and others, were printing materials, agitating the public to be opposed to the British Crown. And most of them weren't professional journalists. Thomas Paine never worked in a newspaper. He never worked in any media outlet or anything like that. He was just a citizen who had other jobs, but he was using the press to express himself. And that's what freedom of the press means. It's not that there's a certain group of people who are licensed as journalists who get to do something that no one else gets to do. It's the opposite. It's that all citizens have the right to avail themselves of the right to be heard and to inform their fellow citizens using the press. It's something that's available to all citizens. So it doesn't matter whether someone is quote unquote a journalist. But I think you put your finger on something very important, which is, the idea that some people on the right are opposed to basic civil liberties or free speech is not new to me. That's not surprising to me. What's disturbing is how much support there is for people from the left that seem to want to trust Google and Facebook and big tech companies or even the government to police and regulate and censor our discourse. And one of the things I'm trying to do more than anything is to make people understand that the power of censorship or the power to punish journalists is not about left or right. It's about anyone who wants to challenge establishments of power or the narratives of orthodoxy and piety that the establishment disseminates, whether on the right or the left. So you mentioned earlier that videos of yours, even the one you did with me, had been taken down by YouTube. All over the world, leftists are being victimized by big tech censorship. The first reporting I ever did on Facebook censorship was in 2016, and it was reporting that I did about how the Israeli government makes lists and gives them to Facebook of Palestinian journalists and activists who they claim are inciting terrorism, by which the Israeli government means criticizing Israel. And in 98 or 99% of the cases, Facebook takes these lists and bans and removes the Facebook pages of those people in Palestine that the Israelis want silenced. That's how censorship works. It's a majoritarian tool that is always going to be used against the marginalized. Now, sometimes the marginalized are people who have views that you dislike, fringe right-wing voices. But if you applaud censorship because it's aimed at some right-wing voice that you dislike, the precedent that you're affirming, the system that you're upholding, is one that says that the government has the right to ensure that anyone on the fringes, anyone on the margins, won't be heard from and can be silenced. And the only voices that will be heard are these licensed, credentialed corporate media outlets that do nothing but disseminate and never question, challenge, or undermine establishment pieties. And that's the whole point of that system, which is why it's insanity for anyone who views themselves as being on the left to support it.
Our viewership has a very strong interest in Edward Snowden. We interviewed him in 2017. Therefore, I want to ask you, how is he doing and what is his status in Russia?
He's doing very well, given the fact that he is a person who is confined to a country that he didn't choose to live in for now 8 years and cannot leave that country without facing the immediate and certain threat of being arrested by the world's most powerful government and put in a cage for the rest of his life. So given that highly repressive restriction under which he's been living since 2013, he's doing well. He is married. He had a baby about a year ago with his longtime girlfriend, now wife. He has done very fulfilling work. He works with the Freedom of the Press Foundation, which is the organization I co-founded along with people like Daniel Ellsberg, the whistleblower who leaked the Pentagon Papers to the New York Times, Laura Poitras, who worked with me on the Snowden reporting while she was based in Germany, and several other transparency advocates. He's the president of that organization. He wrote a book last year. He does speeches. He participates. So he's doing very well from the perspective that he has his liberty in Russia, and he has his liberty to speak out, and he often does on privacy and surveillance. He criticizes the Russian government. He criticizes the United States government. So all things considered, he's doing quite well, and needless to say, views the choice that he made not with regret, but with great pride, as he should, because he knows that it contributed a great deal to the world in letting us know the threats that come from state surveillance.
To my last question, you left The Intercept last year and now publishing your work on other platforms. Could you tell our viewers where they can follow your work and why you chose these platforms?
Sure. So I did leave The Intercept in October of 2020 because in the weeks leading up to the election, they tried to prevent me from publishing an article which I wanted to publish about evidence suggesting or raising ethical questions about Joe Biden. And I went to Substack, which is a platform designed to protect writers like myself who do have anti-establishment views that don't fit comfortably into corporate media and mainstream media, to be able to reach large audiences without being censored. And I've been writing there for the last year. I also now do video content and create video reports on a platform called Rumble, which is a competitor of YouTube, but designed to ensure freedom of speech, to not deplatform people. Like your videos have been deplatformed because they cross some invisible line or another set by Google. And I'm also as well doing podcasts and interviews on a new podcast app called Get Callin, or Callin, Callin, which has a similar ethos that is designed to ensure freedom of speech. So I think what you're seeing is the emergence of this media ecosystem and this part of the internet that is about independent journalism, that is designed to shield people from the increasing repression of big tech and the power of the state to censor. And for me, that has become one of the most important causes for my journalism, which is I'm trying to make sure to do my journalism and bring my audience to platforms that are protecting these values.
Glenn Greenwald, Pulitzer Prize winning journalist, thank you so much for your time.
It was great to be with you. Thanks for having me.
And thank you guys for tuning in today. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel by clicking on the bell below, and to visit our alternative channels in Rumble and Telegram. It's also mentioned in the description. Last but not the least, don't forget to donate so we can continue to produce independent and non-profit news and analysis. I'm your host, San Raza. See you guys next time.
These are the building blocks that make up our organization and the goals we would like to achieve. In order to continue our journalism until 2022 and realize these values fundamental to our democracy, we need 1,000 supporters in our crowdfunding campaign, donating only €5 or dollars per month via Patreon or bank account. Right now, we have only 200 supporters and are not able to take the next step. Our future is in your hands. Strengthen independent journalism and be part of meaningful change.